and he didn't think he would experience that very possession himself. He's surprised to still be in his current body, and no matter how hard he rubs his eyes, he cannot get rid of a character information status screen. We learn his name is Larson Maiden, and he's really possessed a character in the novel, and it had to be a star-crossed supporting character. His brothers would kill him in 9 years. On the first day, we see him wake up yelling, and the maid begins to apologize profusely, and gets on her knees, saying she's committed a crime worthy of death. He wonders who she is, and says she doesn't look Korean or Western, and asks her where he is. She apologizes again, saying she didn't know he had to wake up, while bashing her head into the floor. This shocks him, and he asks if she's okay, and she is scared, and screams, "Don't hit me." And we learn she passed out from him standing up. On the second day he learns his name isn't Cha Sung-min anymore, and that he met a boy named Hampton, who records his daily log, and when Larson asks him about it he apologizes and says he'll finish quickly. Larson watches him, and we learn that every movement of the successors of reputable families is closely monitored, and another person will record your daily activities, and it happens every day from onward of 14 years old. He is startled to see Larson, and spills ink all over the book, and he apologizes, saying he'll clean it up quickly. We see Larson kicking the boy in the face, because his body is reacting by itself, at least, that's what it feels like. After the second day, he started to recover his memories, and at 4 years old, he used a toy stick to beat up the servants that attend to him, and one of them was Hampton. At 5, he learned the truth about his birth, and that he was a child born from a maidservant. And while he was afraid of his father, he had no fear for his mother, so he treated her poorly, and he spit on her face. He did this at 7, and just overall, he has a horrible personality, and he would always do terrible things to the servants, one after another, just going on a rampage. And when he was 8, he beat up a little girl with a stick, and afterward, he went around bragging about it, because the girl Rosalind is 6 years old, and the only daughter of a reputable martial arts family, and because of this Larson's father had to bow his head to the Grandel family's head and apologize. And before Larson turned 9, he was banished to a remote mansion, and we see a few days ago, he threw a tantrum over some chocolate. And we learn again that Larson is a character in a novel that Cha Sung-min wrote. And while Larson was designed to be a rat, he wasn't created with this much detail, or memories, and this isn't a world that Cha Sung-min wrote about. It's a world he didn't, which means these are all things that occurred by themselves in this world. The third day we see him acknowledging the possession, and that it isn't a dream, but a reality, and that the Larson from his novel had no details about how he looked or his abilities, because he only appeared occasionally, and since it wasn't set on when he would appear, he has a talent for martial arts, and it's a trait he wrote down, but never used. So from the reader's perspective, he never had talent, and he died at the age of 17. Larson decides to make surviving his top priority, and since he's 9, there are still 8 years to go until he's executed, so he can dream of a future for the next 8 years, but the problem is what comes after that. The true protagonist of the novel, Kassan Shade, is bound to fight against the Maiden family, because long ago, the Maiden's family had killed the first son of the swordsman family on accident, and it was a complicated scenario that is kept hidden for quite a while, but due to it being found out the two families went to war, and since the novel is named after the Shade family, they obviously won the war, and the Maiden family was pretty much destroyed. He wonders what to do, and when he should do it, and even though it was a poorly created world, he is still the creator, so all of the plot armor meetings that Kassan had were made by him, so he knows the future. He resolved himself to take advantage of these things, to live a better life than he had previously. And since he only gets to live the life once, it wouldn't be a bad idea to enjoy it. And because of the martial arts trait, even Larson didn't know how strong it was, and he's probably a genius because he possesses the blood of one of the 3 great families of this world. So he's been born with a golden spoon. So besides the fact, he's a rat, and only has 8 years to live, he just needs to do something about it. He notices the status window again, and we see it mentioning that he's activated the Heavenly Eye, and Larson is shocked because this was the ability of Kassan. It means the status window he's seeing is the Heavenly Eye, but wonders why he has it because he isn't the protagonist. He explains more about Kassan's ability, and how the novel is a Munchkin, a min-maxer, fantasy novel, and that Kassan is strong enough to destroy the entire planet, and even the universe, and the problem here is that he used that same power to destroy the Maidens. Larson looks down and notices a ring, and that it isn't something that can normally be seen, almost as if his body is being analyzed. He wonders if it's signifying the first circle, and he explains that circle refers to a ring that is created by gathering mana around the heart, and it is used as a fuel container when using magic. We learn that in the story he wrote, it requires a lot of effort and time to get even the first circle, and that a rat like Larson wouldn't train magic, and he doesn't remember him training either, so it appeared automatically. He hears a knock at the door, and he says it must be Hira, and she asks if she can enter. We see the maid kneeling, and it cuts to him telling her she should kneel when she sees him. Larson is annoyed by the rules he set previously. He is shocked when he sees her status window, and we see that Hira has a talent in assassination. He wonders why she has a talent in that, and he doesn't remember putting it in her character. He comments that the world in the novel is crazy, and it's not different from an uncivilized wilderness, so someone intentionally placed an assassin by his side, and they sent the assassin there even though it's a remote location, so it has to be someone fighting to be the successor. He realizes he could die, and has to tell himself to calm down, and he must smile even if it's forced, and she might kill him if she sees an opening. And he realizes that the fear she has of him, and her tears was all acting. He realizes her trembling is real, at least that's what the heavenly eye is telling him. He calls to her, and tells her to bring him some chocolates, and he wants her to get out so he can sort out his thoughts. We see her outside the room, wondering what happened, because the expression he gave off seemed different than before, and she noticed it a few days ago that the air around him feels different, something completely different. We see her float down the hallway like an Erd Tree burial watchdog, and it cuts to Larson going through all the information he has. He mentions again he's been banished to this mansion, and his father has abandoned him and pushed him to the bottom of the successor ranks, and even if he has no chance of being a successor, he's still monitored, and that his family has a villain-type role in the story. But he decides to behave like a decent person to ensure his survival, and now he possesses the power of the protagonist, and knows the future, and where the artifact is located, so he must participate in the succession war, because if he doesn't, he'll be marked as trash. And here, he can live his life without worry, he can travel and enjoy being carefree, and just needs to maintain a middle position, so he doesn't overstep his boundary, or underperform, and he's done it before as a soldier. Now he has a clear idea of how to behave, his heavenly eye deactivates, and Hira opens the door saying she shouldn't find the chocolate, and he tells her it's okay. She begins to say she's committed a crime worthy of death again, but is interrupted, and Larson tells her to get lost. Since he needs to maintain the scoundrel image and mentions it's scary, she doesn't make a sound. He tells her to get lost again. Outside the door, we see her wondering if she heard him wrong, and that someone who usually goes crazy over chocolate says it was okay. So she'll observe him more before making a report. It cuts to 1 week later, we see Larson telling Hampton to get ready. And Hampton asks what for, and he tells him he's going to the training building. Hampton questions him, and Larson yells, asking if he needs to repeat himself. Larson thought about a lot this last week, and to survive, he needs to participate in the succession war, and he needs to train hard, and to survive and gain independence. So it's time to use that power. Hampton recognizes that he's changed, and that he used to beat him regularly for not assisting him properly, but now he wants to train. It cuts back to before, and we learn that Larson learned that Hampton is talented in poison, and Larson thinks it's because he's preparing himself against him. And that a well-trained aide is assigned to all successors as their assistant, and they would devote their life, and are called shadows. It cuts to the training building, and Hampton is happy that he's here to train, but wonders where the sudden change has come from, and it's not that he's afraid of him causing trouble, but his heart aches when he sees people despising Larson, and he decides to trust him. Larson is surprised to see the training facility as a modern building in a fantasy world, and says he did a half-assed job with the setting, but it makes him comfortable because it's what he's familiar with. There's an administrator living in each of the buildings, and we see Noah, the administrator of the Leaf building, introduce himself to Larson. He greets him back, and we learn that he slapped Noah a year ago for not bowing all the way to greet him, but is angry he doesn't remember him. Larson tries to look at Noah with his heavenly eye, but it doesn't work, and he mentions it must be because he's strong, and decides not to be cocky, but nice to him. Larson asks what kind of training he should start with, and to recommend a monster that's suitable for his age. Noah asks his age, and Larson tells him, and we learn Noah has a grudge against Larson, so to pay him back, he recommends for him to fight a mushroom monster. Larson remembers writing about it, and tells him it'll do. Noah says the prep will take a few minutes, and Larson wonders why Noah is so happy. Larson thinks the monster should be an easy monster if the sixth young master, who wasn't written about, could kill it. Larson focuses on the mana around his heart, and realizes that his talent is magic combat, and he's already grasped how to use magic. Noah tells him it's ready, and we see Larson inside a simulated mushroom forest. Noah closes the door to the room and wishes him luck. Larson sees the monster, and we see a tiny mushroom thing bouncing. He decides to get started, and begins to charge his fist with mana. A status window appears saying the will of his physical body has been confirmed, and the magic combat technique in his body has been activated, and he feels the magic circle moving. Noah says before he joined the Maiden family, he was regarded as a genius, yet Larson humiliated him for not bowing far enough, and that today he'll pay him back for that, and the monster he's fighting is at the highest level, and that Larson's technique is considered a low level, so he can't damage it with a technique without any elemental attributes, and with this, he'll get his revenge. He is shocked to see Larson's fist glowing and him jumping at the monster. Larson punches a hole through it, shocking Noah. Larson is surprised it was so easy. Larson's status screen pops up again, updating him on his technique, and mentioning that the unpredictable things are becoming predictable. And he can feel the blood surging in his heart, and we see a technique called weight utilization being imprinted on his circle, which surprises him. Noah is confused by Larson's demonstration of a pure magic technique, and that it's a type that deals physical damage, but that the mushrooms have physical resistances, which confuses him. Noah says it doesn't look like the mushroom monster is good enough, and Larson agrees. Noah says he is thinking of increasing the difficulty, and Larson says he almost ran out of mana, and asks how much it'll increase by. Noah tells him it isn't a lot, but he'll need to kill it quickly before the monster spreads. Noah puts aside his grudge, and decides to get information for his report, and if he thinks it'll be dangerous, he'll stop the training. Larson comments he didn't write about the mushrooms in detail, and we see the monster appear, and besides the color, he wonders what the difference is. He narrowly dodges the abrupt attack from the monster, and watches as it flies back at him, but he blocks it. He comments on its speed, and says it isn't intimidating. And we see it launch at him again, but he blocks it, and Noah is surprised. Larson comments that it's a simple pattern, so he'll use his ability, and he grabs it, and imbues his hand with mana, but realizes he doesn't have enough. But he hits it anyways, and comments that it felt like time had slowed down, and we see his heavenly eye deactivates, and he decides to analyze what happened once he accumulates more mana. Hampton is surprised by what he witnessed, and wonders if Larson has trained himself. Noah asks if he's undergone his 10th year ceremony and wonders why he's so strong even though he hasn't gone through it yet. Hampton is surprised that Larson has a mana circle, and is brought to tears thinking he's been training secretly, and hugs him. Larson realizes he's created a commotion, and decides he needs to act low, so he fake passes out. Noah tells Larson to go get a healing mage. We see Hampton waking up a healer, and he is surprised to hear that the 7th son is here, and not the 6th. It cuts to the healer looking at Larson, commenting that if he's injured from a side effect of his technique, it'll be hard to heal him, and decides to pretend to heal him, then pass him to a higher ranked mage. The man casts a healing spell, and as expected, there wasn't a reaction, because it wouldn't work in the first place, and decides to half-ass it. But we see Larson open his eyes, and the mage is shocked and wonders if his healing ability has improved. Larson thanks him, and everyone is shocked to hear him say it. It cuts to Hira out of breath, and she's brought chocolates for Larson, and apologizes that there's only 2, and he tells her it's okay to just leave those and go. While thinking that he doesn't want to torture her anymore. He tells her he's tired from training so leave. She leaves, and it cuts to Hampton telling her that Larson went to train, and she is shocked. It goes back to Larson eating chocolate, and he says he normally doesn't like them, but this chocolate comforts him, but he realizes something and activates the heavenly eye to notice that the chocolate is spreading throughout his body, and we learn it gives him mana. This is why he has so much mana. He feels like the character is gaining depth, and that it must be from the predictability being reorganized, and is still surprised by eating chocolate to gain mana. Because normally, mages look for places that are filled with mana, and suffer to absorb mana, and it seems like Larson has a unique constitution he didn't write about, which is why it was unpredictable before. And the side effect of free mana appears to be weight gain, and he wonders what the flow slowly talent he gained previously is. Hira knocks on the door, and we see Larson's other brother arrives, and he is extremely rude to Larson. We learn that Larson was scared of his brother Carlin, and Larson greets him. Carlin asks what he's doing, which confuses Larson, Then he tells him he should be crawling like a bug into Neil. But Larson's flow slowly, talent activates, and he can see the swing in slow motion, and he decides to find out how strong the talent is. He deflects the swing, knocking the weapon out of Carlin's hands, and this angers him. He wonders what Larson is doing, and yells at him, telling him he'll kill him. He activates some mana, and we see water form around his fist as he tells Larson to die. Larson notices some water on the sides of his face and his abdomen, and realizes it'll be troublesome if their formation finishes, so Larson breaks them and quickly gets behind him, and then appears back in front of him to deliver a blow to the stomach. His brother begins to cough up blood, and he yells for Hampton to get a healing mage. And he wonders if it's because he attacked him before his magic manifested. Hampton runs into the room, asking about the situation, and Larson tells him to get a mage again, and he runs off. Larson recognizes he overdid it, but learned the most effective way to deal with a mage from it. The next day we see Hera and Hampton talking, and she's shocked that Larson beat Carlin, and Hampton goes to tell her he's actually a shadow, and she tells him she knows, and that everyone other than Larson actually knows. He tells her she's too silent to be a normal maidservant, and she says the same thing about everyone knowing. And he asks if she still thinks he's a scoundrel, and she tells him to keep talking. He explains that he thinks that Larson is serious because of the ceremony approaching, and it cuts to Larson outside of the library, and he is shocked by the size, and is more surprised that Larson's never visited it before. He sees a countless number of books, and he says he wonders how many books there are. A voice tells him about 200,000, and he wonders where the voice is coming from. He sees a rainbow aura and a woman appear from it. He asks who she is, and she says she's the librarian Evian. It cuts back to Hera and Hampton's conversation, and she asks if what he thinks makes any sense. And Hampton says, what if Larson's been hiding his ability this entire time? And he tells her he's seen it himself, and he's finished the first circle, and asks if it can happen overnight. And to think about how his name hasn't been brought up at all because of his behavior. And imagine how convenient it is only Hera is monitoring him, and that's why he's intentionally kept a low profile. She says it doesn't make sense, and isn't his talent just limited to combat techniques? Hampton says so, and he's sure of everything he's said so far, because he is his shadow, and that he's shown him there's a future, and that they are bound to be abandoned here if he dies anyways. So instead of allowing that to happen, they should work together. Hera says if he goes to the library, she'll consider it, and maiden members competing for the succession war need to study at the library and devise a strategy. It then cuts back to Evian introducing herself, and Larson cannot remember who she is, and uses Heavenly Eye to see her real name is actually Larvian, which he recognizes. She says it's an honor to meet him, and we learn while she didn't fight against Cassin directly, she's one of the highest ranking mages, and she slaughtered a lord and his knights, turning them into icicles, even freezing their entire castle. And what she does in the future is basically a disaster, and he's surprised that she's here even though she's a wanted person. And he wonders why the librarian had to be her, and why she's just staring at him. She tells him to sit down, and she'll give him tea, and offers him black tea. He says he likes it, even though he doesn't, and she disappears. And he's glad this is his first time here, because there's no telling what the original Larson would have done. She asks what he's there for, and he tells her a book on mana cultivation. She asks what kind, and he tells her the most basic of books. She thinks it's redundant, and he pretty much tells her rather be safe than sorry, and the phrase confuses her. She finds a book for him, and we see her use magic to give it to him, and he tells her she can leave now. She leaves, and we see him reading the book on mana, and we learn that mana describes all types of energy that are distributed into nature, and to be a mage, you must form a ring first, and you would need to know the equations for that, and he explains some quantum physics type shit, and is lost because this is meant to be the most basic book. And that the information is just too weird, but he realizes if he can't do it and he activates his Heavenly Eye to see the completion is at 5%, and that his ability is monstrous for analyzing words, he doesn't understand. And another problem is that Cassin also has the ability, and he uses it much better than Larson does. We see the percentage go up, and he wonders if he'll completely understand it at 100%, and now he just needs to resolve his mana problem, and decides to stop there for the day. It cuts back to the mansion, and Hampton informs him that Lady Soso is here, and Larson sees her and wonders why his mother appeared at a time like this. He mentions that in his past life, he always missed his mom, because he couldn't see her, and he watched her die in the hospital. And he suffered a lot from this emotionally. But he's surprised to see that she looks so similar to his mother, and he notices she has an illness known as the blue dot. We see him having tea with his mother, and remembering what the past Larson did to her. He calls out to her and says he doesn't know where to start. We see Hira watching, wondering if he really was putting on an act previously or not, and then we see Larson apologizing to his mother. She is shocked, and he tells her he doesn't know if she'll believe him, but he's come to his senses, and her voice cracks while saying, "Is that so?" Larson's mother only listened to him apologizing, and gave simple answers, and her voice made it clear why she only gave short answers. She tells him she'll be back later, and that she has work to do. Larson knows she doesn't actually have work to do, because she's not a maidservant anymore. He explains more about the blue dot illness, and it's a disease where 3 blue dots appear, and nobody knows why, or how to treat it, and once there are 3 dots, it's incurable, but currently, it's only at 1. We see his mother crying behind the door, and she wonders why she keeps crying because it's a good day. Her own son has finally called her mother. Larson calls out to her, asking if it's alright with her, if she could spend an hour every day with him. He tells her they will drink tea together, and she agrees. He explains that the tea has the potential to cure the blue dot disease, and she's still his mother, and she's never given up on him, and he wishes for her to stay healthy. It cuts to night, and we see his mother wondering if this is all a dream, that he's changed into a different person. She calls out to someone asking if they are listening, and tells them about what happened today, and we see a candle flicker. The next day we see Larson telling Hira that he's going to tell her something important, and she wonders if he found out who she is, and wonders if he's going to ask her to assassinate someone. He tells her he wants more chocolate, but only the special kind. She wonders why she was expecting anything, and he says he has one more thing to tell her. And she thinks it's the important thing, but he just asks for more sweets, which disappoints her. An hour later, we see Larson looking at a mountain of diabetes, and he begins to succumb to the urges of the sweet tooth and devours the chocolate. He comments on the different prices, and how they give different amounts of mana based on the quality. And that it's also possible to gain mana from the other bakery he told Hira about. And that's because they share a common ingredient. He calls out to Hampton, and tells him to get him the baker, and 30 minutes later, we see the man standing before him. He wonders why he's been called for, and is scared because of the rumors surrounding Larson, and afraid he might kill him. He hopes everything is alright, and Larson asks what he put into the sweets, and to tell him every ingredient. The baker begins to apologize, and Larson tells him he hasn't made a mistake. He just wants the recipe. The baker tells him the recipe, and he recognizes the ingredient between the both of them, which is the 1,000-year herb, and he realizes that's how he can gain more mana. It cuts to the training hall, and Noah is informed by the healer that Larson beat up Carlin, and Noah thinks he's a lunatic. Noah wonders when he got so powerful, and the mage asks if he thinks Larson did it because of the upcoming ceremony, and that Larson beat the hell out of his brother, and wasn't aware he had that much skill. Noah tells him even if he grows fast due to his combat technique, there's a limit, and not only will he be unable to surpass the Grandels, but he'll have issues incorporating elemental spells, and everyone has turned their back on that kind of study. It cuts back to Larson eating the 1,000-year herb, and he mentions how he can eat these and not gain calories, unlike the chocolate, which gave him pudge, but now he can burn the fat with his core. And by increasing his mana and using Heavenly Eye, he can grow quickly. 3 days later, we see he's finally processed the magical book he was reading, and he gets a notification that a secret page from the Great Sage has appeared. He sees that the Great Sage left his mana cultivation technique, and he wonders who that is, but to learn more, he needs to go to the library, but he's scared of Evian, and prefers to keep his distance, but he has no choice. We see Hira on the ceiling above him, observing him. It cuts to the library, and as he wonders where Evian is, she jump scares him, and he hands her back the book he borrowed. She quickly throws the book, storing it back, and she asks if he's looking for something else. And he asks about the Great Sage Alberto's book. She tells him it's in the library. And he asks her to give it to him, and she says the book is impossible to understand, and he tells her he just wants to look at it for fun. She begins sniffing him, and he compares the feeling to a predator smelling their prey. And she tells him he smells good, and he pulls out the chocolate bar asking if it's what she smelt, and asks if she wants some. She says no while quickly grabbing the chocolate and says if he's going to force her, then she might as well take it. He's surprised by how she's acting, and wonders why she's acting this way. As he's leaving, he wonders how she'll react to a compliment, so he tells her if she wants more chocolate to come to the mansion, and he'll let Hira know about her. He wonders if she'll come, and thinks to himself he hopes she doesn't. We see him staring at the book, and the status screen displays that he's 42% of the way to understanding the book, but it's not as exciting as he thought it would be, and wishes the book wasn't filled with weird claims made by the great sage. It then cuts to outside, and we see Hira and Hampton watching Larson running, and commenting on his recent changes. Hira says it's not a normal workout, and when Hampton asks what it is, we see Evian appear behind them, explaining that he's melting mana by working out. They are shocked by her sudden appearance, and Hampton asks if he should tell Larson she's there, and she says he doesn't have to, and he wonders why she's there, and he understands she's a high-ranking magician, and that the librarians are meant to remain neutral to the succession war. Evian says the rumors are different compared to real life. Hira tells Evian she was meant to give her chocolate if she stopped by. And she never thought she would like chocolate. Hira thinks that Evian must be furious to be receiving it as a gift, and Evian quickly takes it, and goes back to observing. Hira wonders why Larson gave her chocolate, and wonders what happened between the two. It then cuts to 3 days later, and he's finished analyzing the book and how it's absorbing the contents. He's glad it's over, but is overcome by a feeling that brings him to his knees. He feels as if his heart is going to explode. He realizes if he doesn't properly read the flow, his heart will explode, and that he needs to read it with the heavenly eye, and is shocked to learn that you could die just from misinterpreting a book, and he begins to focus. We see later on in the day he's finally engraved the teaching from the book, and due to the influence of it, he's now able to see the backstory he couldn't previously see. He begins to see the backstory of the world, and now he'll be able to learn more about the unpredictability, and the strange feeling from Evian, and it's revealed she loves chocolate. He recalls a moment when he was watching a friend's son, and he scribbled into his backstory notebook, but now he understands why Evian's behavior was strange. He hears a voice saying it's useless for someone like him to concentrate, and he is alarmed to see he's surrounded by fire, but he realizes it isn't hot and sees a figure. She calls out, asking if he has a death wish, and we're introduced to his sister Persia, and we learn she has 3 attributes, and he wonders why she's here. And she asks if she should cut him up, and we learn she hates weak people, and has a hobby of cutting people up. She gets annoyed that he isn't responding, and he goes to apologize, but realizes it's a bad idea, and understands this must be a test she's given unintentionally. He tells her he wasn't pretending to concentrate, and realizing it's his only shot, continues with what he was saying, and she tells him to continue. He explains he was truly concentrating, and that he knows she's saying this to see if he would lie or apologize, and she begins to laugh. She comments on how the rumors of him changing were true, and he tells her he's trying to live as a decent person from now on. She says it's a little too late for that, and summons a fire snake at him, saying once he thinks it's too late, it really is too late. The snake coils around him, and he tells her he knows he cannot be patriarch, because he knows what he's capable of, but he can help someone else become the patriarch. She tells him to keep talking, and he says he'll become an unexpected variable, and she wonders if he'll even be useful. He tells her that will depend on the person who decides to use him, and she asks who he wants to support, and he tells her he doesn't know who will become the family head, but he knows his sister Ivelia is often talks about, and he tells Persia he knows she's scared of her. Her fire snake begins to hiss at Larson, and the fire begins to increase in heat, and he says it feels like he's going to be burned alive. She tells him she let him speak because she thought he was cute, but now he's talking nonsense. Larson tells her he knows she hates lies, and he'd rather speak an offensive truth than act weak, and he may submit to honor, but he will not submit to power. We see the flames vanish, and he tells her since he spoke the truth, he hopes she'll forgive him. She pulls out a ball while calling him an idiot, and hits him in the stomach with it. He looks down to see that it was an apple. We also see that because of her hitting him, he gained a new magic combat technique. She tells him to eat it, and that she found it on the floor on the way here. He inspects the apple and sees that it's actually a karshan, which is a mana elixir. Larson comments that because he's the maiden's youngest, this is possible, and that Kassan is probably also being flooded with gifts, but he wouldn't have space for a karshan, which makes him better in this regard. It cuts back to Persia commenting on how the scoundrel actually made a first circle from self-study, and if he truly acted like a scoundrel so far, then he's very sly. And that she needs sly people for her war, and she compliments how he is fearless, but says it's obvious where his limits will reach. So he has no chance of becoming the patriarch. She calls for her shadow Sando, and tells her to continue spreading bad rumors about her brother, and to stop him from meeting their other siblings. While she wonders if he ate the karshan, She tells Sando to watch over him so he doesn't die from eating it, and it would be troublesome if people found out that she killed him, and if he doesn't eat it, then it'll become interesting. And if he's dumb enough not to eat what she's offered him, then it'll be okay for her to cut off his limbs. We see Larson analyzing the Karshan, and it warns him he'll die if he overconsumes it, and he needs the help of a mage, preferably one that can use water, ice, and wind. He wonders why she gave it to him, and wonders if she wants him to be indebted, but then realizes she probably only did it out of curiosity. And if he absorbs the Karshan properly, she'll probably make use of him, but he doesn't know if she'll keep him by her side or throw him away. But if he doesn't eat it, she'll definitely cut off one of his limbs, and he realizes he needs an ice mage's help now. He thinks of Evian, but says she'll probably kill him instead, and people will think he just died, and she'll be able to take the Karshan. This is just what he thinks is the worst case. We see Evian walk to his door, and he realizes he cannot just hide it because she's probably already detected the Karshan's mana, so he calls her in. He tells her he's sure she's detected it, and he's called her over because he didn't want to hide it, and asks if she wants to make a deal. He tells her he cannot consume it by himself, and needs her help. She reminds him that she is a librarian, so she must remain neutral and cannot aid him in the succession war. He tells her he's not asking for help with that, and he just wants to commit himself to magic and further his prowess as a mage. She comments that he sounds like a model mage, and someone has been spreading bad rumors about him. He tells her he has no intention of joining the succession war, and she replies by saying the maiden family children would spend their whole lives trying to become patriarch. He tells her it has nothing to do with that, and he just wishes to become stronger. She says, regardless of that, as the librarian, I am unable to get involved, so ask a maiden mage for help. He tells him he can't trust them and sincerely asks for her help, and he wishes to protect his mother. This surprises her, and she recalls witnessing a mother sacrifice her life for her son after he stood up for her. And we learn that is why she killed that king previously mentioned. She comments about how Larson has been monitored his whole life, and the family abandoned his mother, and that Larson had to put on an act to degrade his value. And he's serious about observing his mother, but it's impossible because in the maiden family, everyone is strong, and he's just a scoundrel, a byproduct of lowly birth. So his dream is impossible to achieve, but still, his dream is not wrong, and she says dreams don't need to always be fulfilled, and chasing something is also considered a dream. She says, to be clear, I am not helping you because of the chocolates. We see Larson is happy, and it cuts to her preparing to feed Larson the Karshan, telling him what she plans to do. And that there's a chance his body may freeze, and if he's lucky, it'll only last a few months, and worst case, a few years or death. He wonders how she can say it so calmly, and she tells him that she's a capable mage, so she'll do her best to ensure it doesn't happen. He contemplates waiting to absorb the Karshan, and realizes he has to do this, and Evian will do her best to stop anything from going wrong. He tells her he's ready, and she reminds him that she's still a full-fledged mage, so she will need to be paid for her work. And tells him it's not much, just give me 24 chocolates. It cuts to a bloody Persia, asking Sando if Larson has consumed the Karshan, and she informs her Evian has helped him. She asks if she meant the librarian, and wonders how he convinced her to do that. Sando says she couldn't get closer, so that's all she knows, and apologizes. Persia is surprised by his trump card, and comments that the Karshan was a special grade, so if it weren't someone of Evian's level helping him, then he would have died while consuming it. And says he must know that Evian's name is Larvian, and she asks if he's properly consumed it, and Sando says yes, but as a byproduct, his body has become extremely sturdy, and it even surprised Evian. And even his consumption speed was very fast. Persia asks Sando how long it'll take him to fully absorb all of the mana, and mentions how it usually takes 3 years, but he'll probably do it in 1. Sando says, based on the current speed, 3 weeks will be good enough, which shocks Persia. It cuts to him running, and he mentions how he's not tired, even after running for a few hours, and he says it feels as if there's too much mana, and it's going to burst out. He tells Hampton to take him to the waterfall garden, and we see him climbing the waterfall and says it'll consume more energy compared to running. He then tells Hampton to bring him a weight, something made of lead. We see his magic technique begins to protect his body as he climbs, and the techniques begin to upgrade in tiers. He comments on how his body feels lighter. We see as it goes week by week, he increases the weight, and Hampton warns him not to injure himself. Larson comments on how he's overflowing with energy, even without having slept much recently. And it cuts to Samba telling Persia he's fully absorbed the Karshan's mana, and that he has a monstrous body, and informs Persia he's been climbing the waterfall daily. Persia asks if he's using magic, and Samba tells her he's using magic combat techniques. Persia comments that combat techniques have rapid growth, but quickly hit their limit. Samba tells her that he's been climbing with 50 kilograms, and Persia is confused and asks if she means 5 kilograms. Samba also tells her he climbs it very quickly, and Persia says he's overflowing with vitality and wonders how long he can live for. Samba says if they leave him be, then he will die in 3 months, that there's too much mana in his body, and if it weren't for his special power protecting his body, he would have exploded already, but if Persia helps him, he might survive. Persia says it's troublesome, and she's already done her part, so for now, they should just watch. And if it looks like he's going to die, then they need to figure out how he got Evian to help him. It cuts back to Larson, and he comments on how much he's changed after absorbing the mana. It shows him drinking tea with his mother, and she asks if he thinks he's lost too much weight or not, and he tells her it's just from exercising. She tells him while it's nice to look good, his health should be more important, and he tells her he's very healthy. Then his mother compliments the tea Hira made, which makes her happy, and she compliments her too. Larson is glad his mother and Hira are friendly, and comments on how her blue dot has faded a lot too, and that things are going well. It cuts to Larson lying in bed talking about the dates, and he mentions that it's an important birthday, but the real importance is that someone named Ludia will come to his house from the West Gate, and that they are part of the Tribe of Fire, and nicknamed the Crimson Butcher, and One-Armed Sorceress. And that she will get into some trouble and be kicked out from the West Gate, but will get caught by his sister, and that's why she became one-armed. And after that day, she held a grudge toward the Maitons and became Cassin's greatest ally, and she possesses the power of fire, and Cassin makes a contract with her tribe, and assists them on the battlefield. So it would be great if he could get one of the artifacts from her that would have gone to Cassin. He realizes someone in stealth, and recognizes her as Persia's shadow. He decides it's better to feign ignorance, and decides to deactivate his heavenly eye so he doesn't notice her. But he's unable to deactivate it, so he decides to act like he's sleeping. She misunderstands the situation, and is shocked to learn he can cultivate his mana in his sleep, and she mentions how dangerous the task is and just the slightest loss of concentration may kill you, but he's able to do it while sleeping? She is confused and doesn't know how to report this. Because all he did was learn the basic technique, and she doesn't think it's an outstanding technique, but is shocked that it's active while he's asleep, and it's stable. She also comments on how he was able to fuse the Karshan mana with his own, and went through a big physical change, and that the fused mana is being gathered into his heart. But he seems way too healthy, and has no issues with his heart. Rather, his mana is stabilizing further as it goes. And his heart is abnormally strong. He finally stops faking sleep, and it cuts to him outside, and he tells Hira and Hampton to follow him. They ask where they are going, and he tells them they are going to the West Gate. We learn there are 4 gates, and the West Gate is the outermost gate, and that today he is going to meet Ludia. We see a girl panting, and she tells some people she is going to kill them while imbuing her hand with fire, and Larson wonders if it's too late. We see under Ludia's character information, that she is extremely super-minded, and he regrets writing her so half-assed. Hampton asks what she's doing, and Larson tells Hampton to scatter paralyzing poison, and to make sure to paralyze Ludia no matter what. Hampton throws the poison toward her, and we see the bag fly over her head and bursts into a powder, and she falls flat onto her face. One of the guards stops Larson by asking who he is, and he tells them he came from inside, and calls him incapable, wondering how he's a gatekeeper. The gatekeeper asks who he is, and Larson tells him he'll be taking Ludia, and the gatekeeper tells him he can't do that, and to reveal his identity. Hampton clears his throat and begins to spit some facts about Larson's family, and introduces him to the gatekeeper as the 7th son. The gatekeeper yells, asking what kind of nonsense is that, saying that they obviously don't know what Larson looks like, and he's ugly. Larson asks for his name, saying he'll remember it, and asks if he really thinks anyone would try to impersonate Larson, and everyone knows that Larson is a scoundrel, and an ugly pig. And asks again if he thinks anyone would impersonate him, and if he doesn't believe that he's Larson, then send someone to the main family and confirm it, but if he acts arrogant and ignores his words, then he'll make sure he pays greatly when he realizes he's the young master. The gatekeeper gets on his knees and bows to Larson, apologizing, and he asks why Larson is trying to take the girl away. Larson didn't come up with an excuse, and decides to wing it and says she's attractive, and the gatekeeper says he understands, while Hira looks confused. It cuts to Ludia tied up, and everyone is looking over her. Larson gains a notice saying that because the predictability has been affected, a new variable has occurred. Larson wonders what it is, and we see Ludia wakes up and begins barking at them. He cannot understand her because of the tape over her mouth, but he realizes he needs to treat her simply, and asks if her father is sick. And he tells her his mother is sick, so he knows why she is here, and he tells her he knows that she's a mage from Hiren, and part of the tribe of fire. And he knows her territory is dealing with an epidemic currently, but he knows a way to cure it. And that she probably came here recklessly because she thought his family has the cure. And asks if she understands what he just said, and to nod her head to confirm. She nods her head, and gets Hira to take the tape off her mouth, and asks if she's calmed down now. She asks if he's really going to help, and he says he already told her he would help, and she asks why? He tells her it isn't important, and she says nobles won't help for free, at least that's what her father said. Larson asks why she came if she thought that was the case, and she said she has something valuable to offer. Larson recognizes that she means the Holy Grail of Fire, the artifact Casson originally got. He tells her he'll cure her father, but it will take a lot of money. She says she doesn't have any, and he tells her to just pay him back later, and he'll only know how much after treating him first. She says she'll do whatever she can to pay him back, and he asks about the valuable item she mentioned, and she says she'll give him that too. With the negotiations complete, he tells Hampton to scatter 1,000-year herb around her territory, and to boil the herb with the silver sea water there, and it'll cure the epidemic. Hampton says he's never heard of this type of medicine before, and asks him to explain it, and Larson tells him not to doubt his light. Hampton begins to admire him and says he'll do it. Hira tells Larson she wants to ask him something, and he asks if she wants to know about how he knows about the medicine, and she says yes, and that she's unable to understand it. He simply tells her he's a maiden, and she hesitates for a second, then thanks him for the lesson. And she says looking at Larson is like looking at the patriarch when he was younger. Larson tells Ludia he'll release her now, and she gets angry, saying she's never told him her name before, and asks how he knew it, and Larson realizes he made a mistake. He tells himself not to panic, and asks if it's strange he knows her name. She says very. He asks if it's strange that he's using an expensive herb on her, and she says it's strange. He asks if it's strange he's telling her a secret only available to the maiden family, and she says it's strange. And he asks if it's not something that benefits her greatly, and she says it's strange. And he asks if she understands she just showed bloodlust to someone who might be her savior, and she gets embarrassed, saying yeah, and she apologizes. He gets her to repeat it, and she says she was in the wrong, and is sorry. He accepts her apology, and tells her to stay here first. She asks why, and he reminds her she just attacked the maiden family. Larson asks what the gatekeepers said, and she said they told her it isn't a place for lowly people like herself, and that if someone like her lost her father, it didn't matter, so she was going to kill them all. Because she loves her father, and they told him to die. Larson tells Hira to release her, and she asks who Larson is, and why he's treating her so well. He introduces himself, and it takes her smooth brain a second to recognize who he is, then asks if he's the scoundrel. He asks if that's what the rumors say, and she says yeah, that he's meant to be total trash, but she sees that it was false, and he's a good guy. Another status window appears, saying an unexpected variable has occurred, and he wonders if making her his ally is truly the right thing to do, and he decides to keep observing for now. It cuts back to the mansion, and we see Hampton telling Larson he's gathered the herbs like he ordered, so he'll depart for Hiren immediately, and it'll take him around 3 days to get there. He asks Larson why he helped Ludia, and Larson says it's unfair for someone to die of a treatable illness, and because it's her father, it doesn't cost him anything to help. Hampton thinks to himself and compliments Larson, and says he's met the true light, and tells him he'll be back. Though the real reason he helped her is because of the Holy Grail of Fire. 2 days later, we see Persia has arrived, and wonders what Larson has brought back. She sees Larson, asks who he is, because nobody in the Maidens has been this handsome. Larson tells her it's him, and she says it feels like he's hiding things, and he tells her isn't, but we know he is. She asks how he became so cute, and compliments his looks while grabbing his face. He feels like his heart is about to freeze, and his magic combat technique begins to protect him. He's surprised by its activating just from locking eyes with her, and she compliments him for achieving it all in 3 weeks. She pats his head and says his face is a pass, and if he continues to grow like this, she'll pamper him a lot. He tells her he doesn't need it, and thinks it must be another test, and he tells her he wants to become her rival, or an ally, rather than being pampered. She says he'll make a great piece of art if she decorates his decapitated head, and he tells her not to make such a bad joke. She says it wasn't a joke, and she wants to see the toy he brought back. He wonders why she wants to see her, and says that Persia doesn't like other talented fire mages, so he mustn't let them meet. He tells her he found the toy, and he doesn't intend to show her. She releases killing intent and says he keeps trying to step over her, he resists it with his combat technique, and she commends him on it. Her mana continues to pressure him, and she releases it and says she'll give him a chance. And explains she'll just use one finger to fight, and she won't use any elements, and only combat techniques. He asks if she knows combat techniques, and she says she's read about them briefly. Larson smirks and tells her he'll use everything he has to defeat her, and she compliments him again, and launches a fire snake toward him. His heavenly eye detects the illusion, and he punches it, destroying it. She's glad he's grown a lot since their previous encounter, and tells him if he wins, she'll leave his toy alone, so he better give it his best shot. Because if she isn't entertained, she'll destroy his toy. She never thought he'd entertain her this much, especially since he's the son that father threw away. We see Larson leaping at her, and she tells him he's too slow and hits him with her finger. He blocks it, and it sends him backward. He lands on his feet, and he realizes if it continues like this, it'll be disadvantageous for him, and the difference between them is too large for him to dodge and attack her. His iron will protects his body, and he's surprised by his mana being in shambles just from one finger. His cultivation calms his mana down, and he realizes this is his only chance, and he'll be aiming for her right leg. He grabs onto her leg and swipes her other foot, causing her to fall, and he channels mana into his fist, and slams it down into her face. He is surprised to see all of the bones in his hand is crushed, and that she's used defensive magic. She asks if he charged in like that because she let her guard down, and he tells her yes, and it was his only chance. She tells him his combat technique is unsightly, and that's why she dislikes them. He tells her it wasn't classy, but she still lost, while holding onto his shattered fist. She uses her magic to lift him up and throws him into the wall, making him cough up blood. She tells him he won the bet, and she'll ignore his toy, but he keeps piquing her interest. She comments on how tough his body is, and to test it, she puts some strength into her last attack, but it turns out he's still weak. She says she'll see him again, and vanishes into flames. She finds it interesting that he absorbed her mana, and that's why she went overboard. But she also added some healing mana, so if he uses it well, he can learn from it. Sando says it seems like she adores Larson, and Persia tells her he's interesting. Sando mentions how she gave him a gift, and Persia says while she did give him one, if he fails to use it properly, his body will fall apart. It cuts back to Larson continuing to cough up blood, and we see his status window says he's fulfilled a special requirement, and his self-recovery technique has been enlightened. And he realizes anytime he meets Persia, he receives a great opportunity. His body begins to heal, and we see another message mentioning body restructuring will now start, which confuses him. Then he starts to become overwhelmed with intense pain, and says it feels like his bones are being pulverized. We see some nasty-ass goo leaking from his ear, and other parts of his body, and he begins to scream in pain as his fingers begin to move uncontrollably. His techniques begin to engrave themselves into his body, and we see Haria and Ludia run into the room. Haria sees the room is covered in black powder, and wonders if it's poison, then says it's too weak, and wonders if it's fog made from waste. Another status window saying reconstruction requires a large amount of mana appears, and Larson wonders where his mana is disappearing to. Another window appears, saying he has insufficient mana, and if it continues to be insufficient, then the process will stop, and he'll have a terrible side effect. Larson sees fire, and then sees Ludia spewing flames toward him, saying she'll help him, and he begins to absorb her mana, as it's great for purification. He thanks her and begins to walk out of her fire, and we see the body reconstruction has been completed. They call out to Larson, and another window appears, saying his heavenly body has been activated. And we see he's gained some significant muscle from the reconstruction. Larson mentions how the heavenly body is the physique that Kassan was born with, and that it's part of the requirements for an attribute known as Sword Emperor, which is what Kassan had since the start. And he wonders why he keeps getting things that are meant to be for Kassan. He tells Hira to bring him clothes, and he realizes he must hide his attribute. We see Ludia talking to Harriet about her father already being cured, and after he wrote a letter saying how everyone in the village has gotten better, and thanks to Larson, the epidemic is disappearing. Ludia wipes a tear out of her eyes while reading the letter, and tells Larson she'll repay his kindness. She tells him she'll be her contractor, and we learn the contract of fire is what Casson made with Ludia later in the story, and the tribe members can only make the promise once. And it entails them devoting their lives to the contractee. Larson realizes if he makes the contract with her, then the original story will change a lot, and that the future Ludia from his story will disappear. But he doesn't care, because he needs to get out of Casson's grip by the time he reaches 17. He tells her if that's what she wants, and she makes the oath in front of Larson, and as he's watching the Oath of Fire, he notices the status window mentioning some of the settings are being revealed, and he gains authority of berserk restraint, and he explains that in the novel Ludia would go berserk often because her brain is smooth, and now he can control her rampages. He sees that if he stops her, then she will die, and he tells her doesn't want to do it, and she says it's a good thing though. He asks how, and she cannot answer, and he tells her that she'll need to sacrifice her life to him, but she thinks that is a good thing. He asks why, and she says it's cool, and he explains if she rampages and he stops her, then she will die. And she tells him that's fine, and it would be her honor. He tells her he doesn't want that, and she tells him to stop worrying, because she won't die. He tells her that she's only 9, so she's too young to become anyone's contractor, and she says it doesn't matter what her age is. He says maybe to her it doesn't, and he tells her he thinks it's too much of a responsibility, and that they are too young to understand the contract of fire. She tells him he'll wait, and calls him a good person. At least, that's what her father said. And explains that he told her if anyone rejects the contract, they are a good person, and they are someone she can trust, so don't let someone like that go. It cuts to her saying how good the chocolate is, and he tells her it's time for the valuable thing she mentioned previously. And he comments on how it must be the Holy Grail of fire, and mentions where it's located. She says the item is in her neighborhood, and Larson asks for the name, but she doesn't know, but she knows it's a cup. He uses his heavenly eye to learn more about the Holy Grail, and sees it means the owner won't die from poison, and can resist mind magic, and other great things, so it's perfect for living a long life. He tells her it's time to go, and Harriet asks if he needs an escort, and Larson remembers that every maiden needs an escort, and he wonders what excuse he needs to give, for his family to provide him with an escort to Ludia's hometown. And he realizes he can't lie, and that the escorts will be supporting one of his siblings, and he contemplates on what to do. When he makes up his mind, it cuts to a mage named Jaffel, and he's on bad terms with Larson, and he wonders why Larson wants him to be his escort. It cuts to a flashback from 3 years ago, where Larson is telling Jaffel that he's just a dog, and should listen to his owner. Larson remembers it and regrets the past him acting like that. Hira asks what she should say on the document, and he tells her to just put that he wants to try their chocolate. She says there's no way that would work, but it is instantly approved. It shows Jaffel arriving at the mansion, and Larson greets him, but this makes Jaffel angry. He tells Larson he's changed a lot since their last meeting, and he asks if he can ask a question, and Larson asks if he's curious as to why he was chosen to be his escort. Jaffel says exactly, and that he's just a dog. Larson tells him since he's just a guard dog, he should guard the owner too. This angers Jaffel, and Larson tells him among the dogs that he's the most trustworthy, and he doesn't think he'll betray him. Jaffel asks if he trusts him, and Larson says he doesn't trust Jaffel himself, but he trusts in Jaffel's ability as an escort, and that he's ambitious. And he explains that Jaffel is extremely trustworthy, and explains that he swaps from being loyal from his fourth brother, to his second sister. Jaffel asks Larson how his ambitions are linked to him being chosen as an escort, and Larson tells him he could be useful to him one day. Then tells Jaffel he knows that he's planning to swap his loyalty to his second sister, and this shocks Jaffel. Then he tells Larson he's just an escort, so he has no allegiances. Larson comments that despite him saying that he's quite emotional, and that it doesn't matter to him, and what other reason would an escort need to protect his owner? Larson orders him as a maiden to protect him, and Jaffel accepts the order, and questions how Larson changed so quickly, and comments on how full of mana his circle is, and says even the second sister couldn't have a circle that full of mana. It cuts to them walking, and Ludia is excited that she's going to see her father. Larson explains that while her tribe had a ton of power previously, the god they serve used up its powers, and they've gone downhill since then. We see Ludia inhale a large amount of air, and then she screams, letting out what we can only assume is hockey. We see Hampton run up, and he apologizes to Larson for not greeting him, and Lydia asks where her father is. He tells her he's at home, and we see her running off to greet her father. Jaffel is still baffled by how Larson knew his intentions, but it cuts back to Lydia hugging her father, and he thanks Larson. Jaffel wonders why Lydia is her friend, and why all of the townsfolk are showing gratitude toward Larson, and he wonders what Larson did without anyone having noticed. Lydia grabs Larson and guides him to the present, and we see them arrive at a tombstone made with stacked stones. Lydia begins to speak enchantment table, and the rocks begin to shift, allowing for the holy grail of fire to emerge from the stones. Jaffel wonders what the grail is, and realizes that Larson saying he was here for chocolates was a lie, and he can feel a weird mana from the cup. Larson looks at the cup and the heavenly eye, and we see some more backstory settings are explained. If someone who didn't make a contract of fire drank from the grail, then why would die? So he must make a contract to drink from it, and the longer he waits, the worse the quality becomes. And he realizes that he'll need to be in charge of controlling Lydia, and wonders if he will be able to do it. He wonders what the Oldham would do, then resolves himself, and asks her to form the contract. She looks excited that he wants to, and he tells her they need to do it quickly. She says okay, and the Holy Grail begins to change form after recognizing the contract of fire. Jaffel is shocked by the Grail glowing, and realizes Larson planned all of this from the start, and he compliments Lydia's mana, saying how pure it is. And that he's sure the information about Larson has been misinformation. Lydia tells Larson the contract is finished, then the status window appears, mentioning an unexpected variable again. And we see a massive amount of fire energy in Larson, but then it vanishes, and the status window says the Holy Grail has evolved. Larson grabs onto the Grail, and drinks the water inside of it. His cultivation technique begins to manage the fire energy, and he tells Jaffel to protect him. Jaffel is confused why he's suddenly cultivating his mana in the middle of the open, and mentions how if he takes even the slightest bit of damage, it'll cause great harm to his body. Jaffel recalls him saying he trusted in his abilities, and creates a barrier around Larson. We see Larson's self-recovery activate, along with the water from the Grail being absorbed into his body, but after some time, the heavenly eye deactivates, and we see it's now nighttime. Jaffel asks if he's finished, and Larson replies by saying yes, and thanks him for protecting him. Jaffel says he's just doing as he was ordered, and it seems as if Larson has gained some kind of power. Jaffel also tells him that this area is the entrance of the Dragon Mountain, and he feels a powerful mana approaching them, purposefully making their existence known. Larson asks if he knows who they are, and Jaffel says they seem to be swordsmen, and they'll soon reach them, and one of them seems to be very powerful. Larson explains that swordsmen are rivals to mages, and he doesn't know why they are coming, but it's too late to outrun them, and he would be executed by his father if he ran away. And with Jaffel, there's no point in running away. They arrive in front of them, and the heavenly eye activates. Larson is surprised to find out that the real protagonist of the world, the one with massive amounts of plot armor, Cassin Shade, is standing before him. It's not just Cassin, but the guardian knights of his family are there too, and he's sure Cassin recognizes him as a maiden too. Cassin approaches them, and bows his head, saying he came because he felt a powerful mana wave, and that there was a surge of fire mana too. And he came because he was curious. Larson says it seems like he knows who he is, and Cassin says he doesn't know who exactly he is, but he knows he is a maiden. And he thought he was the sixth son, but he uses water magic, but he doesn't smell water on him at all, and asks if he is the fifth son. Larson wanted to avoid getting involved with him, and he wonders how to deal with the situation, and debates what to do, and realizes if he gets caught lying, it would be difficult. So he just tells him that his fifth brother uses mainly earth magic. Cassin asks if he's the seventh son then, and Larson laughs and says he's much different from the rumors, right? Cassin agrees, and we see his guards are flabbergasted. Larson tells Cassin to speak casually since they are the same age, and he gives some backstory about Cassin, on how he's always had an abundance of things, but he never had friends his age. Lydia grabs Larson's arm and asks if Cassin is his friend, and she introduces herself, and says that he's handsome. Cassin blushes and tells her his name, and she compliments his name too. Cassin quickly changes the subject, and asks Larson what the mana wave he felt just now was. After an explanation, Cassin says it seems as if he gained a good opportunity, and Larson says that he did. Kassan asks what kind of power the mana held, and Larson says it protects from external influences. Kassan quickly understands it's like poison and stuff, and says it's a good power. Jaffel realizes if the Shades attack them, they would be helpless, but is surprised they are just standing there. We see Ludia and Kassan talking, and Larson calls out to him, and says he's never seen someone from the Shade family before, on top of that, someone the same age as him. They shake hands, and Kassan says it's the same for him. Larson tells him he's heard that in the swordsman family, they have to cross swords before they can be friends, but doesn't know what it's called. And Kassan tells him it's a duel, and Larson asks if he wants to try one, and that he heard it's mandatory to become friends. Kassan says it's not a requirement, but confirms if he's asking for a duel? And Larson says exactly, and realizes it's a good opportunity to see how big the gap between them is. Jaffel is confused by the duel request, because there are guardian knights on Kassan's side, and that he cannot step in. And because Larson is a maiden, he cannot step in to stop him, and especially because of the Shade family, because it could represent him looking down on the bloodline. Kassan asks Larson if he's learned swordsmanship, and he says no, and he's only learned magic combat techniques. Kassan comments on how nobody is learning those, and Larson says it's all he's good at. Kassan asks why he requests the duel, and he's heard that the Maitons don't like his family. Larson mentions how Kassan has no friends, and everyone is shocked, but Larson says he doesn't either, so they are in the same situation. And he guesses it's because of the families they were born into. And he tells Kassan that it's harder for him to find friends, because his family doesn't allow them, and they are only allowed friends under the guise of business. And he doesn't believe in that as a friend. Thus, he has none. But he thinks that his family will allow Kassan, and that's why he requested the duel, and he mentions how Kassan's family really cares for trust, and if there isn't a solid foundation of trust, then it can lead to someone being hurt. Kassan agrees, and Larson tells him he can think of his techniques as martial arts, and Kassan tells him he'll only use his family's basic swordsmanship, and because Larson is unarmed, he'll grant him the first 3 hits. Larson asks who would win if they dueled, and Kassan is hesitant to answer, and Larson tells him it would, of course, be him. But asks why he requested a duel if he already knew the outcome, and Kassan says because he wants to be friends, and they talk about if it matters who wins or not, and Larson tells him if he only wanted to win, he wouldn't have requested a duel, but he wants to be friends, and that friends should be equal to each other, and to treat him casually. Kassan tells him he has no intention of insulting him, and Larson tells him he's going to do his best, so he wants him to do his best as well. The duel starts, and we see Kassan thrust his sword at Larson, but flow slowly activates, and he sidesteps it, and he jumps backward to create space. Larson charges back in, but is stopped by another thrust from Kassan, and Larson wonders how to close the gap so he can use his techniques, but if he goes in too close, he'll be in Kassan's range, and if he doesn't try to go in then he'll continuously be attacked, and he's expected as much from Kassan, but now he's able to kind of read his attack trajectory. He rushes in past one of Kassan's attacks, thinking it's a feint, but realizes it isn't, and Kassan changed it to a real attack, but it's too late to dodge, so he has to tank the hit. He blocks it, and we see him kneeling in pain, and Kassan points his sword at him, to which Larson admits defeat. Jaffel is shocked, but is glad it ended without any problems. Kassan asks Larson how his arm is, and he tells him it's fine. Kassan comments on his defense, and that he was surprised by the sparks from when he hit him. Larson is confused about what he means by sparks, and thinks maybe Ludia did something. And Kassan explains to him that his sword is of high quality, and can cut steel. Larson is shocked because it hit his arm. Kassan tells him he tried to lower the power, but is still surprised by his defense, and Larson thanks him, and says he knew he would lose because of their gap in ability. Kassan stretches his hand out to Larson, and says others find it hard to approach him, and Larson says it's because everyone is weaker than him, and it's not strange for the weak to find it hard to approach him, and Kassan asks if that makes him strange then, and Larson says he just felt as if he could trust him, and Kassan laughs saying he's never met anyone like him before. This reminds me of the fox and the hound. Kassan says it was nice meeting him, and tells him they should meet again, and disappears. The status window appears again, mentioning that an unexpected variable has occurred. As he wonders about it, Jaffel asks him when he learned fire magic, but Larson doesn't know when he used it, but realizes the fire energy near his heart isn't strong. But it's still there, and that it contains fire energy. He analyzes the fight with Heavenly Eye, and we see that he uses fire mana to help block Cassin's attack, and that the water from the Grail fused with his cultivation technique, but is confused because it should be impossible to fuse an element with a combat technique, and even if it was possible he'd have to be an advanced mage like Persia, and even then it would suck. Jaffel asks how he did it, and Larson says he doesn't know, and Jaffel is confused about how he doesn't know, and thinks that he actually does, but doesn't want to tell him how, and he wonders if he planned beforehand to meet Cassin. And if his plans are this developed, then he must be getting help from someone else like Persia, and he realizes he better play his cards right. He tells Larson he'll take him back to the maiden family, and we see Ludia yelling at Larson to take back his words, and he wonders what she means, but recalls that he told Cassin he has no friends. She tells him she thought of him as a friend, and he tells her she's his friend too, and she asks why he told Cassin that then. And he tells her he made a mistake. And she says as long as he means it, then it's all good. And she tells him that she'll forgive him this time because he forgot. It cuts to Larson having dinner with his mother, and Larson asks his mother what his father is like, and we learn he has no memories of him, because Larson never met him previously. She tells him that he's lonely, which shocks Larson, and we see on the status window that his father loves his mother. And we hear a voice saying, "I'm lonely, huh?" And a portal begins to form on the wall, and a man emerges from it, and it is Larson's father Dekatra. They both greet him, and Larson comments that the air has gotten dense from his appearance, and that it makes it hard to breathe, and that his body is afraid of him. His father calls out to him, and says he heard something terrible happen to Larson and his brother, and Larson says yes. His father asks why he did it, and Larson says because his brother was attempting to push him with his fist rather than magic. And he felt as if the honor of mages was being ruined, so he responded using the commandments of mana. And he wanted to end the fight quickly, and because his brother is a mage, he wasn't fatally injured, and he tried to bring his brother to his senses. And he doesn't think the succession war is simply about spilling blood, and he doesn't believe his siblings as enemies, but rather the Grandal family and the Sade family are the enemies. His father says he likes what he said, and Larson says that the sixth brother should be thankful for the experience he gave him in fighting a martial artist. Dekatra comments on how he had no expectations for Larson, but compared to the sixth son, he's much better. Larson says if his brother holds a grudge, he has no right to be a maiden. Larson wonders if what he said is enough, and that he's scared. And we learn that the only person his father has loved was his mother, and the reason Larson was able to survive until 17 previously was because of his mother, and Larson says it makes sense, because while it wasn't stated in the novel, his mother would die from Blue Dot later, and when she died he died too. And because Larson was so weak previously, he was of no use to the family, and they were banished from the family because he didn't want the only wife he loved to be harmed, because the other mothers knew he loved her. And he realizes if he continues to act like a decent human, and if he's able to protect his mother, then everything will change. He tells his father he plans to do his best, and they talk about how magic techniques are weak, and a waste of time, but Larson tells him he will become capable enough to support him, and while his magic has limits, he himself doesn't, and that he carries his blood, so he will climb higher and protect his mother. His father lets a slight smirk out, and it cuts to Hampton and Larson reading a note from his father, and it's an invitation to a banquet, for the 10th year ceremony. Which is when a member of the maiden family becomes 10, everyone gathers and enjoys themselves, and it is when they receive a physical strengthening magic. It's not just a normal strengthening, but it's when a family member gains an attribute for their mana. We see Larson in a suit, and him and Hera head into the banquet hall. Larson looks at the table and wonders where to sit, and Hera says it'll be opposite of the patriarch. He asks where his mother will sit, and Hera tells him she wasn't invited. We see his brother Carlin yelling out, asking if he is Larson, and he's surprised by how much he's changed, and Larson tells him if he thinks he lost because he let his guard down, then feel free to challenge him again. Carlin tells him he'll trample him soon, and Larson tells him to try it. Persia walks into the banquet hall too, and greets Larson, and asks if he's having fun with the toy he took previously, and mentions how they had a bet, which shocks Carlin, because not only did he make a bet with Persia, but he won too. We see a blonde woman enter the room, and Larson is surprised, and we learn that it's his second sister Ivelia, and while she is gentle, she would do anything for the family. And how she was killed by Cassin, but she is also his first love. She sits beside Persia, and says Larson's changed a lot, and Larson begins to feel panicked after seeing his sisters, because he realizes how strong they are and that he's been arrogant. It shows other family members enter the room, even his father, and Dekatra congratulates Larson, and others do too. Ivelia stands up and says she's killed some monsters for father, and the other siblings share what they've done. And we learn that Persia stole a pair of wings from a temple, which shocks Larson, because Heavenly Eye activates and shows him that she slaughtered everyone inside the temple. A knock arrives at the door, and we see Dekatra's right-hand man Senkin enters carrying a bunch of scrolls, and he sits them down in front of Larson. And Dekatra tells him to make his choice. Larson looks at them, and his Heavenly Eye activates to show us the energy from the scrolls all fusing together to make a new scroll, and he grabs it, which surprises everyone because he's picked the transcendent attribute, and he tells them he will choose this one. Saw June would be proud of our boy. Dekatra asks Ivelia if she told Larson about the scroll, and she says no. Then the rest of the siblings say they also didn't. And he's asking if he's meant to believe that a 10-year-old did it all by himself, something even Ivelia couldn't do. And she says he has a better eye than she did at 10. Persia is surprised, and they conclude that it's due to him being talented in magic combat techniques, since none of them learned it. He tells Larson to bring him the scroll, and as he's walking over, Larson briefly explains the elements again, and how the scroll he picked is all of them combined. Dekatra compliments him on picking the scroll, and tells him Ivelia will help him with the scroll, which confused Larson, but Dekatra says if he does it, then there's a high chance Larson would die. And because her mana is softer than his, there's a higher chance he'll survive. Larson tells Ivelia he'll leave it to her, and she explains that it's a dangerous thing, so his chances are only 50%. Larson asks if she thinks he should pick a different scroll, and she says she wishes for him to be strong. And he tells her he'll stick with this one, and she tells him to take his clothes off, and he begins to pull a magic mic. Persia is surprised by how much muscular development he has, and wonders what secrets he has. We see her put her hand on him, thanking him for letting her carry it out, and as she goes to start, he tells her to wait, and that he has to tell father something. He tells him if he survives, then do him a favor. Everyone is shocked by his request, and Larson says it's tradition for the patriarch to carry out the operation, and because Dekatra isn't doing it, he owes him this. Dekatra asks what the favor is, and Larson asks if he'll allow his mother to visit this place. The other wives get angry, saying a lowly being doesn't belong here. Larson says that he's still Dekatra's son, so calling his mother inferior is indirectly calling Dekatra inferior. Dekatra asks Larson why he wants his mother here, and he replies that his mother wants to see him, which surprises Dekatra, and he says if he survives, he'll allow it, so try staying alive. Ivelia starts the operation, and begins with a chant, and Larson's body begins to heat up, as if he was being branded. And he hears a voice saying it'll help him, and he's surprised because he can no longer feel his limbs, and compares the feeling to being anesthetized. He's surprised by a ball of fire in front of him, and he looks closer to see it's the Holy Grail of fire. Larson wonders where he is, and why the Grail is here, and it tells him that it is actually not the Holy Grail of fire, but the Holy Grail of transcendence. Larson cannot analyze it with his Heavenly Eye, and it tells him that the Fire Clan is misunderstanding, and he had fire mana poured into him by Kirtle, but he knows Larson won't know who that is. And Larson recognizes the name from legends, and thinks about the sage Alberto. The Grail tells Larson he wants to help him, and Larson asks how. The Grail explains that his body is special, and that he has a heavenly body, which makes it strong, but not strong enough to take the mana it's trying to take in currently. Because his circle is already saturated, and the Grail asks if he knows what will happen if that power enters his body, and Larson realizes he would die. The Grail says he doesn't want him to die, because it would be boring, and he'd have to sleep for another century. And it tells Larson it'll consume the mana for him, and Larson realizes if he doesn't consume it, his body will explode, so he has to believe in the Grail's words. The Heavenly Eye says the Grail has been desperately searching for his true owner, and Larson explains that when the Grail was Cassin's, it never acted like this. The Grail tells him he has the qualifications to be his owner, because Larson's existence is full of holes, and that's a requirement to take him in. Larson asks what he means, and Grail, new nickname, tells him he'll see later, so he'll just get to the point. And asks Larson to be his owner. And says he's melted into his heart currently, so he'll eat the mana, which will allow him to be reborn as the Holy Grail of Transcendence. Grail tells him that his scary sister will take care of it, so he's gonna take a break while resting inside Larson's heart, and he'll come back when it's necessary. And that he'll have to use him a lot in the future. The Heavenly Eye explains that Grail will act as another mana circle. Larson likes this, and when he goes to accept Grail's help, His body begins to fade out. And he realizes he will die if it continues, and he doesn't want to die, so he accepts ownership of Grail, and we see the cup spew an enormous flame, and then Larson wakes up to Ivelia saying the operation is complete. Larson is surprised he's alive, and wonders if it was a dream, but feels the changes in his heart. And Larson hears Ivelia tell their father that the operation was a failure, and the scroll has been extinguished, and she says she isn't good enough. Decatra walks off while saying it's just Larson's fate, and Larson realizes it wasn't extinguished, but that Grail consumed it. Larson calls out to his father and reminds him of their deal. We see everyone leaving, and Larson puts his clothes back on, and is glad with how things have turned out. He calls out to Hera, telling her it's time to go, but is surprised that she is exuding bloodlust. And she says there's something she would like to ask. Even the Heavenly Eye cannot read her status window, but Larson can tell that there is a security magic in place, and realizes the only person who could set it up would be his father. Hera asks him who he thinks hired her, and he tells her he would assume his father did, and when she asks why, he tells her because she's not hiding her aura even with his father being in the building. She calls him amusing, asking if he can feel her aura, and he tells her yes, and that it's scary. She calls him weak, and he tells her he's only 10. And she asks if his reasoning behind the aura is enough for him to make the assumption on who hired her, and Larson explains more about how she's letting out aura, and even with all of the mages in the building, nobody is coming, so there must be something that is preventing her aura from being detected. And that the only person who can cast security magic like that would be his father. And that she must have taken orders to reveal her aura to Larson. And she says that he's right, and she was told she can do whatever she likes if he couldn't analyze the situation. But Decatra said he would need to be able to do this much to prove he is a maiden, and Larson tells her he understands the intentions from all of this, and that his father wanted to test him. Hera draws a knife, and says he is correct. She says she honestly didn't think he would be able to figure it out. Larson asks what she thought would happen, and she says she thought he would piss himself after she released her aura, and says she will introduce herself to him. She says her name is discreet without a sound, but you can still call me Hera. Larson recognizes the name, and we learn she is like the boogeyman. She is someone that almost everyone fears. Even the swordsman's family looked for them as an assassin, but they failed due to there not being any information about her. Larson is surprised that she's so young, and tells her he's heard of her before because she was being looked for. And she tells him she's surprised he knows because it was 15 years ago. After learning how long ago it was, he asks her if her current appearance is fake, and she says she isn't answering that. He asks how she's going to test him, and she tells him if he manages to deflect her attack once, it will be his victory. She then disappears, and the Heavenly Eye activates, but still cannot detect her. She says that his father has told her to get rid of Larson if he is too weak, and Larson tells her to wait. He asks her what she'll do for him if he wins. And she says she didn't think he'd ask, but asks what he would like if he wins. And he tells her he wants her to protect him, because he's weak, so protect him until he's strong enough. She agrees, then disappears again. He was confident, but he can't sense anything, and even though she threatened him, she won't be able to kill him, so she won't attack above his neck or his heart. So he will have to deflect her attack by letting himself get hit, and she'll have her guard down. She'll aim for his arms or legs, and the moment she attacks, he will detect her. He mentions his flow slowly ability, and explains how it doesn't only make time slower, but also lets him see mana in slow motion, and that the quality has changed. We see a purple mana ring from around his chest, and we learn that Grail let out mana which upgraded his skills, and now he is able to see Hera's attack, and he looks at her attack, and realizes it's his leg, and while he can dodge, he won't be able to deflect if he does that, so he takes the hit on his knee and rears his fist back and punches at Hera equal rights equal lefts, and she blocks it. He asks if that counts, and she says yes and she'll keep her promise to protect him from now on. And she disappears again. Larson is happy to have passed the test. It cuts to Hera saying she'll begin her report, and we see her talking to a candle mentioning what Larson has done, and she compliments his decision making, and says he's unique because her dagger was coated in poison, but he grabbed it barehanded, and despite the poison entering his blood he is fine, so his mana must have purified it, and she will find out if it was luck or not, and she disappears. It cuts back to Larson walking down the street, and Grail pops up asking if he did well, which spooks Larson, but Grail tells him that nobody else can see him. And that he should be praising him, because Hera's dagger had Melia on it. And Larson is shocked to hear that her dagger had poison on it, and he warns Larson that if he receives a big shock, the poison will come back up and melt his body. Larson calls for Hampton, and asks if he knows what Melia is, and Hampton says yes, and he offers to get some for him, and Larson just asks for the antidote instead. After he sends Hampton off, Hera appears beside him, and she explains that she's been appointed as a shadow for him, so a new maid will replace her. He also comments on how her attitude changed, and she says there's no longer a point in acting, and he compliments her on her acting skills. Then he asks her about the dagger, and says it made him angry because if she wasn't going to kill him, then why put poison on it? Hera asks why he pretended not to know, and he explains that it's because he wanted to show her he was fine without the antidote, and now she won't underestimate him. She tells him what the poison was, and he tells her he knows and tells her where it's from, which surprises her that he knew, and she tells him while she's agreed to protect him, there is a time limit, and that he must become strong enough to free her from her duty. He then asks her if she can get him some 1,000-year herb powder, and then he feels his throat is itchy, and he tells her to get him water. He reaches into a bag of 1,000-year herb powder and begins to consume it with water, and Hera notices that his mana is changing, and we see Grail beginning to puke. Larson feels his heart expanding, and Hera wonders what to do because if she moves him, he will die, but she doesn't know what to do because she isn't a mage, and she decides to absorb his mana and die for him. We see the mana continuously expands, and he wonders why he keeps getting near-death experiences. After a bit, his ribs begin to crack, and a status window appears mentioning how managing the reaction is just a requirement, and mentions how if he doesn't have a special body from a swordsman family, he'll die, but there is an exception for those with the heavenly body, and he realizes he can withstand it. Grail tells him he feels better, and to trust him, and we see the mana begins to condense into his heart, and Grail says that his cultivation technique is helping him. Hera watches as Larson's mana goes back to normal, and then she sees fire erupt from Larson, but notices that he is now a second circle. She is surprised because she's never heard of anyone reaching it at 10 years old, and Larson asks if she just plans to stare at him. She apologizes and congratulates him, and she asks if he calmed the mana expansion by himself, to which he replies yeah and says how great he is, and she says it's to be expected of a maiden, and they awkwardly stare at each other. Larson is happy that all of the requirements were met by coincidence, and he asks Hera if she wants to do something, but doesn't say what. It then cuts to Noah sleeping, and Larson waking him up, and he asks why Larson is there so late, but notices the second circle. He asks Larson what he wants, and Larson says he's planning to have a duel with Hera, and we see them inside of the training room. Larson asks if she can duel with his skill level in mind, and asks her not to kill him, and to attack slower, and she tells him an enemy wouldn't be that kind, to which he replies she isn't an enemy, but his shadow. And she agrees. Larson explains that now he's a second circle, the amount of mana he can hold has changed, and he can move the mana however he wants now, and spreads it all over his body. We see his combat magic technique upgrade, and the fight starts. Hera vanishes, and he realizes it's the same pattern as last time, and while he still can't see her, his heavenly eye can detect her movements. And his flow slowly should be stronger now too. We see Hera charging at him, and he realizes she's going for his leg again. He dodges the swing, and she is surprised he could see her, and he dashes in with mana imbued into his fist, and punches straight toward her face. We see her vanish, and a blade is held to his throat, and he compliments her strength. As he goes to declare his loss, she says it first and mentions how she broke her promise to moderate her skills, and says he's improved quite a bit, and she didn't think there'd be this much of a difference. He asks if she's complimenting him, and she tells him not, and that he's still weak. He makes a joke asking if she can compliment him, and she says empty praises are poison. It cuts to Noah watching all of this, and he is shocked that a mage shouldn't be able to move like that, and that Era's movements are barely detectable with detection magic, and that Larson's power is much greater than it was previously. And the scariest part is Hera's last attack, and he realizes it's best to act as if he didn't see anything. Larson apologizes, and waves goodbye, and Noah is surprised he apologized, and then we see a blade to his throat. Hera warns him to forget everything he saw today, and he tells her he didn't see it because he was in the bathroom. Hera says while Larson is a second circle, he still knew it controlling it, and Noah acts surprised about that too, and she calls him smart, then vanishes. Noah wonders what is happening, and it cuts to Larson training, and Hera notifies him of a letter that has arrived, and as he begins to read it, he falls, and says that the swordsman family sent him an invitation. and he realizes this is a variable. It cuts to Dektra having called for Larson, and we see a flashback of him after receiving the letter, and him telling Hera to alert the main residents, and how he plans to be a part of the succession war now. And he says if he wants to kill a tiger, he must go into its den, and Ludia asks to join, which he allows, and he mentions how Cassin wants to be friends with her too, and she likes hearing that. It goes back to the present, and we see Larson enter a room to see Dekatra and Ivelia, and he decides it's time to rewrite the world he has created. He asks Dekatra if there's an order he wants to give him, and Dekatra says that he must already know why he's called him here. And he asks if it's about the invitation from the Sades. And we see a candlelight flicker, and an explosion of ice magic appears, and an icicle points directly at his throat. He asks Dekatra why he set this up, and Dekatra asks why he thinks he is the one who did it, and Larson says if he wanted him dead, he'd be dead, but he didn't kill him, and he doesn't think he's done anything wrong. Dekatra says the Shades should crawl at their feet, and Larson says he agrees, and they should act like dogs in front of them. Larson tells his father about his duel with Cassin, and Dekatra asks how he knew Cassin would be there, and he tells him that it was a coincidence. We see Ivelia watching, and she's wondering how Larson has changed so much, and if it was always like this, then that means someone purposefully spread bad information, and she realizes the only person who could have done this would be her father. Larson notifies his father that he will partake in the succession war, and that he knows he can't grow stronger within the family, so he needs to go outside of it to establish his own power. And Dekatra asks if he's bringing an outsider into a war between siblings, and Larson says it's his only chance. Dekatra asks if he's aware of what he's saying, and Larson says yes, and that he's using Cassin to make him his dog, and how a well-trained wolf can hunt a tiger. Dekatra claps back by saying they can also eat their owners, and Larson says if that happens, it's just fate. But he plans to treat him like a dog, and rather than a swordsman, he'll make him a swords dog. This is an actual L of a joke. It cuts to Larson and Ivelia walking, and she asks Larson if he expected everything that happened just now, and he tells her yes, but he didn't know that she would be called too. Larson realizes that Dekatra trusts Ivelia to protect Larson from the Sades, and she says it sounds like he's been practicing this conversation. And she tells Larson that at his age, she couldn't talk like that to father, and she asks Larson if the strengthening ritual really failed? And he tells her no. She replies asking about what happened to the mana from the scroll, and says he can't tell her, because father told him not to reveal it. And she confirms her suspicion that Dekatra assigned Larson as a variable to her, because he wouldn't be able to talk to Dekatra like that otherwise. And if she can't use Larson effectively, then he'll hand him to the other siblings. But since he gave her the opportunity first, she must raise him properly. Larson tells her there's something he wants to show her, and stretches his hand out. She watches as transcendent mana forms from his hand, and turns into a ball, which surprises her. He asks if she can see it, and she says yes, and she can feel the base of the mana is fire. She tells him not to try so hard and how she already sees his potential, because it's hard to hold a physical form of mana, and she doesn't want him to strain himself, because he's already a second circle at such a young age. And she wants to see him live longer. She asks what he's planning, and he tells her that they won't be the only family invited, and Ivelia says the Grandels must have been invited too, and Larson mentions how the Grandel's daughter, Rosalind, will probably be there too. He mentions how they are going to use a gateway they set up, and he will wait for them there. She asks why, and he tells her because he's been rude to the Grandels, and he recalls beating Rosalind with a stick, and that is why he was exiled. He tells her he's going to apologize to Rosalind, because he was in the wrong. Ivelia says nobody in the Maiden will bow their heads, and he tells her when a mage's honor is pure, they won't, but when their honor has been lost, it is different. And that he hit Rosalind, and acted unlike a mage, so it is right to apologize. He wonders how he beat up Rosalind in the past, because before he possessed the body, it was trash. The Heavenly Eye activates and explains that Rosalind is extremely kind, and thinks violence is savage. And now he realizes why in the future, she is so aggressive, and has a different personality. Because she was upset at Larson, and she realized how difficult it is to be powerless, and she changed because of him. And because of her talent in martial arts, the family welcomed her change. Ivelia tells Larson whatever he does, she will support him. It cuts to the gateway, and we see Larson and everyone walking up the stairs, and Ludia is excited to try all the food at Cassin's, whereas Hampton is worried about going behind enemy lines, and he thinks that Larson has great plans, and is excited to be a shadow. Hira does not care. We see them pass through the gateways, seeing multiple different environments, and we learn they've gone through 22 gateways to arrive where they need to be. And the Grave of Swords is one of the biggest gateways near the Sade family, and while it sounds bad, the city is very active. Ivelia asks Larson if he's okay, and reminds him the Grandels will be there in an hour. And he tells her he'll train his breathing techniques while they wait, and Ivelia wonders what Larson will show her next. We see Dekatra talking to Senkin, and he tells him that the strengthening operation was a success, and it took place in his heart, and that he thinks that Larson has the Holy Grail of Transcendence. Which was the chalice that Kirtle used, but before Kirtle died, he realized the Grail wasn't actually the Grail of Transcendence. Senkin says he's never heard of this before, and Dekatra says it's something only the Maitons know, because Kirtle was close to the first Patriarch, and apparently, the Holy Grail disappeared when he died, and after looking into it, he's sure Larson has it. And he tells Senkin that the first Patriarch used to call the Holy Grail a supporting circle, and Kirtle called it a charger. And Senkin asks if he's sure that Larson has it, and Dekatra tells him it's the only way to explain the current situation. Senkin is confused, and Dekatra tells him that Larson is a second circle and is able to use attribute mana. And even though both of them were called geniuses when they are kids, he asks if Senkin could have been a second circle at 10 years old. Senkin says maybe, but he wouldn't have made it to 17 years old. Dekatra says that Larson has no problems currently, and wonders why he didn't see this talent previously, and tells him there's something he is hiding. He orders Senkin to watch Larson and make sure he doesn't die, at least until Dekatra dies. It cuts back to the Grandels arriving, and Larson comments on how their power is different from the Shades, and he greets Rosalind. Rosalind asks him who he is, and he smirks at her, which makes her recall the beating she received. She leaps toward him, and lands in front of him, asking why he is here. He tells her he wants to apologize, and she laughs at him, and says apologize in a mocking tone. Her uncle laughs, and says he should greet his elders first, and Larson greets him, and we are introduced to Magnar. He is the second most powerful person in the Grandel family, and his martial arts skills are better than the current patriarchs. Magnar says he was planning to scold Larson when he saw him, and Larson says that's not the way the Grandels do things. Magnar is surprised Larson isn't scared of him, and Larson tells them he was in the wrong, and that he will apologize the Grandel way. Rosalind says if he wants to be forgiven, she will kill him. And she punches at his face, but Larson doesn't even flinch. Magnar is impressed, and Rosalind says she thought he would look scared, and tells him to try blocking her next attack. His techniques activate, and we see her hit him in the stomach. He lets out a grunt, and she kicks him away, knocking him onto the floor. Magnar is shocked by Larson's magic combat technique, and how he reacted properly and took the hit. Rosalind asks why he's just sitting there, and Larson says sorry. And admits he was in the wrong before, and apologizes. She asks what kind of nonsense he's saying, and he tells her she was just too pretty. This confuses her, and he explains he wanted attention from her, so he bullied her. She lets out a laugh and kicks him in the knee, and tells him it's too boring if he doesn't fight back, and if he fights too, she'll feel better. He tells her okay, but not here. Magnar agrees with him, and tells them this isn't the place, and we see citizens watching, and Larson comments that everyone will talk about their fight, and tells her people will be hurt if they fight here. This surprises Rosalind, and Magnar is impressed. She mentions how Larson was going to apologize, and he tells her he will, but somewhere better, and Magnar tells her they need to go to the Sade residence. Magnar talks to Larson through sound transmission and compliments him, and tells him to be friendly now if he doesn't want rumors to spread. Heavenly Eye notifies how Magnar will begin to analyze him, and Larson sees this, and another window shows that Dekatra has doubts about lacking probability, and because of the variable affecting the plot, there is doubt around the probability. Yeah, a little confusing, and he sees that he has completed 2 requirements, and one of them is succeeding in influencing an important character, and that a new probability is being created and Larson will be given creator's privilege related to probability, and we see multiple numbers form around Larson, and a note pops out from the air, and we see it's Larvian's character information. He wonders why there's so much empty space on the note, and realizes that her setup was incomplete, and he wonders what is the deal with the probability, and why he possessed Larson, and wonders about all of the opportunities so far. A window appears mentioning a time limit, and goes back to where he was. And now he knows that it has a time limit, and he will have to meet a requirement to look at it again. Magnar tells him Ivelia is waiting for them, and they head out, and he wonders what will change in the future. Magner tells Ivelia she's gotten stronger since the last time he saw her, and she tells him in another 5 years she will beat him, and he tells her he'll accept any time. She tells him she could do that when she was younger, but not anymore. He comments that when she was younger she would charge at him relentlessly, and burned all of his hair when he was asleep. They laugh about it, and Rosalind greets Ivelia, asking if she remembers her. She tells Ivelia she wants to be strong like her, and Ivelia mentions fighting spirit, and she explains how swordsmen use swords, mages use magic, and martial artists use their bodies. And while their body has limits, they can use fighting spirit to do impossible tasks. Rosalind tells her she'll train her fighting spirit to become strong like her, and then it cuts to them having finished eating. And Ivelia says she needs to talk to Larson, and Magner agrees to meet her later. She asks about what happened earlier, and he asks if she means at the gates, and asks if he planned it knowing she would attack him. And he tells her yes, and that's why he went. She said he was planning to resolve her grudge. He should have offered to resolve things at the arena. He asks if she's trying to figure out why he used his magic combat technique, and he says it's because Magner was there, and that he's probably thinking about how he used the combat technique effectively. She comments on how Magner would properly analyze Larson's technique, and since Larson has a bad reputation he probably realized that Larson either changed or was raised to become a variable, and since Larson doesn't know Magner well it's impressive he created this situation. Larson says that Manger probably thinks that he's a variable, and that he'll want to know about him. This surprises her, and she recalls Decatra telling her to make it obvious that he's a variable, and she understands why now. Because Larson's ability to plan things out is excellent, and since he's only 10 his potential is greater than anyone's. So regardless of Decatra's order, she wants him to be one of her people. She tells him how she met Magner when she was 14 traveling as a pilgrim, and mentions how everyone in the Maiden family does it. But she didn't know who he was back then, and if she did she would have tried harder to kill him. And he comments on how her expression looks warm. She says that he told her to kill him if she was upset, and he'd give her 3 chances. He comments on how it seems like her memories of Magner are good ones, and she tells him that Magner is a very curious man. Larson says if he's curious about him then he'll approach him, and he thinks he will learn a lot from him. She tells Larson they still have 30 minutes, and tells him there's a lot to see in the city, since it's a commercial city. Larson asks if she's been to a lot of them, and she says yes, but they've been destroyed because of her. He grabs her hand, and tells her he'll lead the way and they walk down the beach together. It cuts to the Grandels, and Magner is thinking about how Larson has changed, and how that's impossible, so his image was purposefully distorted. And he wonders what the big plan is, and how there is something he's not aware of yet. And that the Grandels are weaker than both of the other families, so if something happens they will be swallowed. And if Larson is at the center of their plans he will figure out what it is. We see everyone enter a portal, and Magner says a portal opened by Ivelia is an honor, and she reminds him she still has 1 chance left. They go through the portal, and Casson calls out to Larson and Ludia. Casson and Larson start talking to each other, and Ludia runs up and separates the two and tells Casson she is closer to Larson. And Casson tells her he doesn't think there are ranks in friendship, and since they've decided to be friends, that's what is important. Because of her smooth brain, she is lost. Get her a map. She tells Casson she is the closest again, and he responds by saying they'll be friends too, and they shake hands while she says she'll be his friend. Rosalind steps forward, telling Casson not to forget about her because she was invited too. Casson bows his head and apologizes. He tells her it's an honor to meet her, and she says he can speak casually to her. She gets annoyed by him talking to the others casually, but not her. Magner watches and is surprised by the dynamic Larson has created, and pretty much compliments his slyness. Larson asks Casson for a favor, and asks for him to provide a place so he can duel Rosalind, and we learn that having some of the renowned families present, it will become Larson's debut stage. It cuts to Casson's father, Karsha, asking him what he thinks about the duel, and Casson says he's envious, and Karsha says dueling with friends is fun. Karsha mentions how he's a scoundrel, and Casson says he's actually a good guy, and would even make a great rival. Karsha is surprised would consider him a rival, and Casson says he is currently stronger, which Karsha likes. And he realizes Larson's information was distorted, so he is a variable created by Decatra. He asks Casson who will win, and Casson says Larson, but then says Larson will lose because he has a soft heart. Karsha says he'll attend the duel, so introduce him to everyone. The next day at the stage, we see Rosalind and Larson getting ready, and Larson realizes he needs to show everyone what he's capable of, since it's his debut. Rosalind tells Larson she's starting, and dashes in toward him. Flow slowly activates, and he dodges to her side. She realizes this and leaps into the air, and kicks Larson. She intended to break a few bones, but he took no damage. Magner and Ivelia are surprised, and Rosalind tells him not to get arrogant because he blocked it due to luck. She kicks him again, but it is blocked, so she goes in for a punch, to which he blocks again, and swings back at her. She leaps backward to create space, and we see she is out of breath while he hasn't even broken a sweat. Everyone is surprised by this, and they realize that the rumors about Larson were all made up, and they believe he's received strict training from the Maiden family. Rosalind wonders why he's only defending and creating space, and Magner thinks about the fight and how Larson is taking advantage of Rosalind's openings, and taking hits while receiving minimal damage, and says that it's not possible unless he is much more skilled than his opponent, and even with magic combat techniques being weak, he is stronger than most martial artists. And the reasons he wanted the duel was to demonstrate how magic combat techniques can be strong, and to show the power of the Maiden family. Karsha says it seems like he and Magner are having similar thoughts, and they agree that Larson has been raised in secret. But wonder why he wanted to show his skills here, and Magner says it's because he wanted to show that his techniques are usable in a real fight. And that he probably knew that the spectators would catch on to all of this. Ivelia is happy, and Casson is surprised by the duel. It goes back to the fight, and Rosalind asks Larson how long he plans to be on the defensive, and he tells her until she's not angry anymore. She says if that's his plan, then to act tired at least. She activates her fighting spirit and punches Larson straight in the stomach, causing him to cough up blood and collapse to the floor. She asks why he didn't dodge, and he tells her it seems like she wanted him to take at least one hit. She asks what kind of duel this is, and throws a potion at him, telling him to drink it. She tells him it's her loss, and she tells him she used her fighting spirit, and she tells him she'll forgive him, and she won't hold any grudges, and he thanks her. Casson runs over, and we see he is inspired by Larson's duel. He tells Larson he can see he's improved a lot, and he's happy by his friend's growth, so he requests a duel with him. Larson tells him he appreciates it, but he's tired from his duel with Rosalind, and that he wants to duel him at his best condition. Larson thinks if he duels him currently, he wouldn't make it, and Casson asks if he wants to have a duel tomorrow, and Larson agrees. Larson walks over to Rosalind, asking for a favor, and she asks if he's going to humiliate her. He tells her he felt something when she hit him, he's not sure what it is exactly, and asks for her help, saying it will make him stronger. She stares at him, and asks why she should help him. He replies by saying to think of it as a debt for later. Rosalind looks sad as she thinks about how she constantly thought of revenge, but now it is all ruined. Her thoughts are interrupted by Magner telling her to give it a try, because doing a favor for a maiden publicly isn't a bad idea. Rosalind says she'll only help him once, and to make sure to repay her. Larson says he'll swear on the name of a future mage, which shocks Ivelia because it means he's publicly saying he will participate in the succession war. Rosalind asks if she just needs to hit him like earlier, and he says yeah. She says it isn't her fault if he gets hurt and punches him in the stomach again. Larson can notice a reaction of the mana moving in response to her fighting spirit. She asks if that's all, and he tells her to hit him again. Weirdo behavior. She punches him again, and Magner watches and wonders what is going on. Karsha asks Ivelia what Larson is doing, and she explains that his mana is reacting to her fighting spirit, and she doesn't know exactly what it is, but it's definitely there. Rosalind asks Larson if he's okay, and he's sure now that it is his transcendent mana, but he's confused because he wrote that fighting spirit and mana doesn't mix, in the story, which means the probability is decreasing. Due to him noticing it, a notification appears, saying he can fill in the lacking probability, and he realizes that there's more for him to do than just survive. The setup book he saw previously appears in his hands, and time stops for everyone except him. The pages begin to turn, and he can see that it mentions how mana and fighting spirit do not mix, but in their duel, Larson's mana reacted to it. He sees the reason is blanked out, and he wonders if he is meant to fill it in. But he realizes if he isn't careful, he can mess with the previous setups, and he can't just write randomly, so he has to think of a reasonable explanation that won't interfere with other setups. He puts the reason as Larson Maiden does not abide by the rules of this world. He thought about other options like Grail, or his transcendent mana, or heavenly body, but thought it to be better to focus on Larsen Maiden, rather than an external factor. And if he sets himself as a character that doesn't abide by the rules, then he will be free from the world's probability, and won't mess with other settings in the world, so Larsen will be an irregular. Time begins to resume, but a notification appears saying that he is able to add another line. This surprises him, but then it cuts to Ludia sleeping, and hearing a knock at the door. She opens it, and Magner asks her where Larsen is. Ludia gets protective, and Magner asks if he looks like a bad person or something. Larsen walks out, and Magner instantly notices that Larsen's body is unique, because it's been training for magic combat, rather than as a martial artist, or a mage. Smooth Brain makes a joke about his abs, another L joke. Larsen asks Hera for clothes, and she appears, which surprises Magner, that someone as fast as Hera is being used as a maid. Magner and Larsen sit at a table, and Larsen asks if he came to see him out of curiosity. Magner says yes, and Larsen says he's curious about martial arts too. Magner says Larsen seems confident that he'll talk to him about martial arts. Larsen tells him that he's sure that there's enough curiosity for it to happen. Magner asks Larsen if he's thought about the consequences of learning martial arts from him. Larsen tells him that is why the Shades invited him, because Decatra can't see what is going on, which makes it a safe place. Magner tells Larsen he'll look at his body first, and is surprised by his back, but proceeds with giving him fighting spirit, and he tells Larsen to accept the energy. And to trust him, Larsen agrees. Magner compliments Larsen's cleverness, and we get a flashback of Larsen adding another line, and he wonders what he would give the main character, and he decides to give himself the ability to grow from fighting spirit without any side effects. It cuts back to the present, and we see him absorbing the fighting spirit, and Magner is pleasantly surprised that there's a mage who can accept his fighting spirit. Magner asks who has been teaching him, and Larsen says he's self-taught. Magner says it's the first time he's seen a body like his, and he asks Larsen if he's acknowledging a maiden using fighting spirit, and Larsen says yes, and he should learn what can be learned. Magner is surprised that a maiden who hates anything other than mages is accepting this, and asks Larsen if he's really pureblood. Larsen says yes, and Magner laughs, and asks Larsen what he wants. Larsen asks for him to become his mentor. Larsen says he's sure that there's a relationship between his techniques and martial arts. And that with fighting spirit magic, combat techniques can truly shine, because it's what they were lacking. Magner asks if he said mentor, and Larsen says yes. Magner asks if he thinks the Maidens would allow it. Larsen says he'll make sure they do. This shocks Magner, and he asks who he is, and Larsen tells him a mage who wants to learn martial arts. Magner tells him that's crazy and asks if he understands what he's saying. Larsen says while it may seem as if the Maidens are bowing to the Grandels, but if he were planning to reject his offer, he would have done it already. Magner realizes he lost, and Larsen asks if he's interested in magic combat technique, and Magner says he's interested in Larsen specifically. Larsen tells him that it is most efficient when combined with fighting spirit, and it will be his own martial art. This excites Magner, and he realizes Larsen planned this from the start, and Larsen says he knew that he was paying attention, and he says while he wanted Rosalind to stop being angry at him, he wants to create a new martial art. Larsen tells Magner his plan is to stay at Sades while they keep him safe. Magner tells him the others will think he's a hostage, and Larsen tells him it doesn't matter because he's a brat, but he's sure his father will reap benefits from it too. Magner tells him it sounds insane, and he can't tell if it's because Larsen is a maiden, or just a freak. But he'll find out by himself, and he'll take him as an apprentice, and he'll take this chance to discover everything the Maidens have prepared, so take this chance and learn everything he can. It cuts to Hampton eavesdropping on the conversation, and crying while misunderstanding Larsen's intention, and thinks he is trying to create a world with the three great families united. Hera hands him a handkerchief, but it scares him. And he tells her she's going to give him a heart attack. She makes a joke saying if he dies that easily, he isn't qualified to be a shadow, and Hera informs him that Larsen will go back to the main family to make an official request, so they might have to risk their lives. Hampton says that is fine because it's a shadow's duty, and Hera asks even if the patriarch punishes him, and Hampton says he will protect Larsen, because he is his light. And she disappears again. It cuts to Larsen talking to Ivelia. There is something he needs to tell her. She tells him to say it later, because these minutes are too precious, to say something too important. He asks her if she likes the flowers, and she says people are attracted to beautiful things, and he says he thought magic would be the most beautiful thing to her. She tells him it used to be, and we see her having a bad flashback of her melting some people's skin off, and she says it became the most brutal thing to her. And at least the flowers do not harm people. Larson tells her he'll gift her a bouquet of flowers next time, and she tells him hearing those words make her heart flutter, and she decides to listen to what he was going to say earlier. He tells her he plans to stay with the Shades, and she asks if he wants to become the patriarch, to which he quickly turns down, and says she can use her special ability to check if he's lying. She says alright and speaks enchantment table to cast her skill, and she tells Larson that he's sincere and asks what made him so eager then? He tells her he wants to live, and she asks what he means. He tells her that even the sixth brother is trying to kill him. She says the war is brutal, but they wouldn't take their own sibling's life. Larson tells her that even their father eliminated his siblings to claim the position of patriarch. She says even so, why do you want to stay here? And he tells her he wants to become stronger so he can live. She asks if there's another reason, and he tells her he wants to protect his mother and himself. This touches her, and we see a flashback of how she unconditionally loves her family, and for their sake, she is either good or evil, and she kills a child when she doesn't want to, but because it's for her family, she has to. While she loved the family, she hated the succession war, and decided to try her best to become the patriarch so she could stop the war, but for that, she needed a magic stronger than anything to obtain peace. And that she was a sorcerer who longs for it. He recalls her saying she killed a Balrog, and he mentions how she decided to kill a monster rather than humans. And he realizes the weight of being the author. To him, everything he wrote was just a book, but for them, it was reality. And while it isn't hard to write about someone being killed because it's just words, the truth is heavier than that. He calls out to her, and says if he wants to become strong enough to protect her, would she consider that pride? She is surprised and says protect me? Then laughs, and says it's the first time she's heard that, and she says speaking with him is always a pleasure. Then he asks her for help with father, saying he'll convince him. It cuts to a pavilion, and we see Larson and Rosalind sitting side by side. He comments on the classical music, and Ludia calls out to him, pointing to the cake, and is fascinated by it. Everyone tells Cassin happy birthday, he thanks everyone, and Ludia hands him a gift saying her father said it was a lucky pebble. Larson thinks it looks like a stone he saw on the side of the road earlier. Rosalind hands him a gift saying it is a sincere gift from her and her family. He thanks her, and she's happy he's speaking informally to her. Larson tells Cassin he hasn't prepared a gift for him, and Cassin says okay. Smooth Brain watches while eating cake, and Larson tells him he would like to stay here and continue sparring, even though it isn't a gift. Cassin is surprised, and Larson tells him he'll get his father's permission, and Cassin says it's an unexpected gift, and that it's always a good time with friends. Larson tells Cassin to tell his father, and that he'll get Decatros permission. It cuts to them back at the warp gate, and Larson talks about how he had two objectives, one was Cassin by his side, and the other was to use Magner to his advantage. Cassin tells Larson to return quickly, and Larson says he will. Rosalind goes to say something, and Larson tells her he hopes they can greet each other with smiles the next time they see each other. She wanted to say it first, but doesn't say anything and walks off while Larson talks to Ivelia. She asks if he understands what he's doing, and that nobody can stop their father's anger. And he tells her he's confident. It cuts to the main estate, and we see Larson standing in front of a door, and he can feel a piercing cold. He walks into the room, and Decatros says no need to greet him, and he understands Larson wants to stay with the Shades. Larson says this is correct, and Decatros asks if he's aware of how this will look to outsiders. And he tells Larson if he can't make him understand his intentions, then he will take it as an insult. A dagger forms in his hand, and we see it as instant death for a mage third circle and below. He asks his father if he remembers the dog house of swordsmanship still an L joke. Decatros says yes, and Larson tells him he's met a boy named Cassin, and that he's vulnerable to relationships and emotions. Decatros says so? Larson continues by saying he's confident in his ability to turn Cassin into a dog. Decatros asks if that's the only reason for wanting to stay, and Larson starts explaining how to everyone else in the world magic combat techniques are useless, but he has seen the potential in them. Decatros tells him to continue, and Larson tells his father about his second circle, and how he has something special in his body. Decatros asks if it's the Holy Grail, and Larson explains that Grail is the reason behind his unique qualities, and that his body has reacted to the fighting spirit of the Grandels, and it's already slowly building up inside his body. And since he's already received an invite from the Shades, they already have a relationship, and since the descendants of the renowned families are interacting with each other, does that really seem like defeat? And that the Shades do not resort to battles of public opinions, and if they started a rumor saying they bent the maidens to their will, then he'll take full responsibility and unalive himself. Decatra says it seems like he's confident, and asks what's next. Larson kneels down, and says since they've offered their hand first in unity, he's sure that his father can figure out how the world will view them. And that absolute force and power are the most effective methods for ruling. But a warm embrace and humble stature are what make a true ruler. Decatra says if he uttered those words without having changed, he would have killed him, and tells him he will observe him to see whether or not he will possess the abilities he spoke of. Larson thanks him, and says he's sure to meet his expectations. But tells him that he's only 10 right now. Decatra asks if he's complaining, and Larson says he needs his mother's care, so please send her to the Shades with him. Decatra laughs, and compliments him for being able to move people. Decatra is pleased with him, but thinks it's unfortunate that his talent is magic combat, but finds it strange that nobody recognized him early on. Larson gets another status window mentioning how Decatra is suspicious of the probability of the world, and that it has partially collapsed. Larson is worried, because if it fully collapses, he will be obliterated too. It cuts to Ivelia reading in her office, and receives a knock at the door. Persia enters and asks why she's reading a book on basic magic. And Ivelia tells her it's nothing, and we learn that she's reading Alberto's magic book that Larson read. Persia says she wanted to tell her something, and Ivelia tells her she won't beat around the bush, and she plans to take care of Larson. Persia says it's funny, because she came to say the exact same thing. Ivelia wonders if father gave her a chance, and wonders if it's a matter of who can take the variable into their hands. Ivelia tells Persia it's none of her business. Persia says she called dibs on him a long time ago. Ivelia claps back by saying she'll act according to the commandments of Mana if she doesn't cooperate. Persia mocks her and says she'll fail, and tells Ivelia she's had several opportunities to injure her severely, and gives some examples. And if it were her, she would have made her crippled, but she didn't do it. Ivelia says that's her misunderstanding. Persia asks if it's really, and we see a massive light emerge from her office. It then cuts to Persia coughing up blood, calling her soft. Ivelia puts her heel on her. Persia asks why she's so interested in Larson, and Ivelia tells her she won't answer that. Persia says the way she's reacting is making her want Larson more, and Ivelia asks why she wants him. Persia says it's because he's cute, and Ivelia tells her to quit playing around, and pushes down on her. Persia says she heard he reached second circle, and there must have been a reason his body is so muscular for a kid, and that she hired a shadow to follow him, and the shadow went missing. Plus, Ivelia is suddenly interested in him. Ivelia realizes that Persia came to see how she reacted. Ivelia tells her to get up and that the elders will come soon because of the mana they released. Persia comments on how Ivelia's reaction only makes her want Larson more. It cuts to Larson eating with his mother, and he comments on how having Hera around means the chance of an assassin killing him is way lower. After he thanked Hera for the food, she says, of course, and that he must eat a lot while growing. He finds her reaction suspicious, and he analyzes the food to find poison in it. He asks Hera if there's something special in the food, and she says not really. Hera has a flashback, and says she used to eat sock in the poison, since she was a kid, and Larson says maybe not something special, but poison, maybe? Hampton cries and gets on all fours, saying it's all his fault, and Larson tells him to explain first. We don't see the explanation, but it cuts to Hera asking how he knew. And he tells her it's intuition, and she does the anime protag glasses shove, saying he must have smelt the socken. And she tells him she'll continue as his shadow to make him stronger. And she tells Soso that she personally made her food, so she doesn't need to worry about the food. Soso thanks her. It cuts to Larson lying in bed with Grail telling him he's here, so the type of poison is irrelevant. Larson says that even with him saying that he looks drunk. Ludia comes to his door, and asks him when they are leaving, and he tells her in the morning. She asks if they can go now, because she wants cake. He tells her they can't go through the gates right now, and she says really? And that she will sleep right now, because tomorrow will come, and she falls asleep instantly. Larson calls out to Hera, and he asks her to move Ludia without waking her up. We see Ludia perform the exorcist, and Larson watches in awe. It cuts to morning, And we see Hampton apologizing to everyone that they need to go by carriage, and we learn that aristocrats drive cars because of his half-assed world setting, and he wonders if this is his first step to independence, and they head off to the Sade residence. They arrive, and while everyone is getting off the carriage, Casson calls out to Larson, and tells him he knew he would be back soon. And Larson tells him he's here to keep his promise, and it's time to duel. Larson is glad things are going as expected, and he tells Casson that it won't be easy this time, and he decides to show his power off. Larson mentions how he's changed a lot since first meeting Casson, and now he's a second circle and much more proficient with his techniques. And now he has all of these other buffs, so it's time to see how he does against an opponent like Casson. He realizes he can't beat him, because that's how he set up his character. No one can win against him, and he's a genius among geniuses, and he just makes other geniuses seem normal, but despite being so talented, he tries harder than others, and he combined hard work and talent to become the best. Larson realizes he must have also improved as well. Casson starts with a thrust, and we see Larson dodge the attack, and flow slowly activates. The two begin to charge at each other. Larson notices his movement, and realizes what his next attack is. And he realizes if he dodges, Casson closes the gap, and that he's fast enough to make flow slowly useless. Casson uses sword ki, and while it might have been an accident, it's good for Larson. Casson realizes it too, and Larson realizes that Casson has let his guard down, so he uses it to his advantage and rushes in. Casson backsteps to dodge, and Larson decides to push in further. Casson thinks he has the advantage and is going to try to make use of it by attacking Larson. He sees Larson imbuing his fist, and readying a punch. Casson puts his sword up to block, and Larson hits it directly, creating a shockwave of mana to explode from their clash. Magner and Karsha are surprised. And Casson realizes that if he lets his guard down, he will lose. He asks Larson how he grew so quickly, and that he's like a completely different person. Larson says it's too early to be surprised yet. Magner comments that if it were Rosalind instead of Larson, the duel would have ended on Casson's first attack. Casson slashes his sword again, and Larson narrowly dodges it. Magner wonders what it would have been like for Larson to be born as a Grendel, but regrets having the thought. Karsha says if Casson were fighting with killing intent, then it wouldn't last long, but it's surprising that Larson can predict his movement. And he chose to charge forward into Casson's sword ki, and use that chance as an opening. And he wonders what message Dekatra is trying to convey through Larson. It cuts to both of them being gassed out, sitting back to back. Casson comments on how fast Larson's growth is, and Larson tells him he's still lost. Casson says it doesn't matter, and he's very happy that his friend got stronger. Larson realizes no matter how fast he grows, due to Casson's setting of being peerless, he will always grow faster than Larson. He tells Casson not to be too happy, because they may be enemies one day. Casson asks what he means, and Larson tells him that it's because he's a maiden, and Casson is a Sade. Casson says it doesn't matter, because they are friends. Larson replies that while he will continue to think of him as a friend, they cannot be free from the world in which people fight for power. Their conversation is interrupted by Karsha complimenting them both, and saying he's proud. Larson tells him he wishes to become stronger, but not just stronger in general, but stronger than Casson. Casson watches, and Karsha tells him that is why he will make a great rival, but asks how he intends to do that. Casson tells him he is planning to learn from Magner. Now Magner is in a rough situation, but he realizes due to the public setting they are in, people might misunderstand what it means for Larson to be Magner's disciple. Magner asks if he has his family's permission. Larson tells him he does, and that he plans to work in harmony so the two families can share their knowledge. Karsha is surprised because Dekatra would normally never allow this. Magner tells Larson there's a test he must take. A window appears saying that the test is to hunt either a red tiger, or a white tiger, and adults cannot help. He tells Magner he will hunt a white tiger, and he asks if Casson can tag along since he isn't an adult. Magner tells him he never gave him an option on the tiger, and he will be hunting a red tiger. Larson quickly agrees, and Magner realizes he wanted to hunt a red one from the start, and that Larson played him. He calls him smart, and he realizes he may have bit off more than he can chew. It cuts to the gang talking about how the trip will be like camping, and we learn they are going to a city called Garin, and that it's near where the red tigers are. Ludia asks if she can tag along to play, and Larson says they aren't going to play. She says she likes camping, though, and he tells her he'll ask Magner. They arrive at Garen, and Lydia falls to her knees, complaining about hunger, and Larson tells her they can go eat nearby and to get up. They are surprised by the lack of life in the city, and when they go to ask a citizen about it, he is scared, and he tells them to evacuate because bandits are going to appear. Lydia tells Larson she's hungry again, and he knocks on a door, but nobody answers. And he wonders what kind of bandits would cause the city to act like this. They immediately feel bloodlust, and a red tiger greets them. We see Clifford, and we see someone riding atop it. Larson uses Heavenly Eye and we learn the man is named Caden, and that he's part of a giant bandit group, and eventually becomes their leader. Caden asks who they are, and Casson asks if he's the leader of the bandits. Caden points to himself, asking if he's asking him, and begins laughing. Casson asks why he's laughing, and Caden says he isn't a bandit. He just enjoys hunting humans. Larson realizes if they fight him, they will die, and he tells Caden he doesn't know who gave him permission to hunt here. Caden replies he doesn't need permission. And Larson tells him the city should have high-ranking swordsmen here, so how is he able to run around freely? And Larson comments on how it's one of two options, either it is a secret deal, or the awful probability he created. Casson tells him they are coming, and we learn that Larson was right, and the probability is screwed. Time begins to slow down, and he's given the creator's privilege again. He writes down something in the blanks, but it isn't shown. Time unfreezes, and Clifford roars while leaping at them. They all dodge it, and Larson says it's faster than he thought, and he's glad they aren't hurt. He tells them that it's obviously a red tiger, and if they are hit by it, they will die. But as Larson goes to explain about Clifford, he is interrupted by Lydia casting a fireball toward it. And he says if she gets rid of it, then they can eat. And hurls her fireball toward Clifford. Caden sits there calmly, and Clifford just eats it. Caden offers them to join the bandit group, and Casson says he has no intentions of joining bandits. And he will kill anyone who terrorizes the citizens. Caden asks if he's really ready to die here. Larson yells out, saying no matter how he thinks about it, this is odd, because he isn't asking who they are even though he's attacking them though he already did. Larson smirks, and it flashbacks to the setting he wrote, and we learn that he wrote the reason Caden is hunting is that he is creating a test. Because from the start, a test had been planned, and even Rosalind went through this. Larson tells him he already knows who they are, and that the reason he's acting like this is that he has faith in something. And while Larson talks about what he has faith in, we see a portal form, and Ivelia emerges from it. Larson and Casson watch, and Casson stares at her in awe. Larson says he knew things were strange, because things were going too well, because the managers in charge of gates are third circle magicians, so it wouldn't make sense for bandits to be able to harm a maid in business. And it's even stranger for everyone to lock their door and run away. And that Caden isn't even a famous villain yet, and he might not have even hunted a human yet. And that a city like this isn't one where you can do these things under the guise of a test, unless it isn't Garen, but a fake subspace, and the only person who can do that is Ivelia. She asks when he noticed, and he tells her when everyone began hiding, and she asks if the fight with the tiger was for show, and he tells her yes, and he should show motivation for the test. She asks what Magner thinks, and he tells Larson he's passed. Caden jumps off Clifford and says as expected from the renowned families. And he kneels, apologizing for his rudeness, and Larson tells him not to worry about it. Magner thought Casson would be the leader of Larson's little group because he's the strongest, and that it would be fun to teach him. Casson asks if the exam was to test if they would be afraid in front of an enemy, and Magner says yes. Casson says that must mean their guardians are nearby too, and Larson activates Heavenly Eye, and we see he is right. Larson is surprised by Casson, and says if he weren't the author, he wouldn't be able to handle this situation at all. And he would have probably passed out from Clifford. Magner asks Casson if he attacked the tiger because he trusted his guardians, and Magner says it's not a good answer. Casson further explains that a wise man is not one who is alone. And if someone is only strong alone, they cannot obtain proper victory. And even if he is lacking, if he has trustworthy people by his side to make up for where he's lacking, then he would be living a meaningful life. Larson comments on how Casson isn't embarrassed to say he's weak, and says that those Casson trusts are his power. Ivelia says that's not something a maiden would think, but hearing him say it makes her heart wrench. Larson gets a notification saying a variable has occurred, but he cannot see it because his proficiency isn't high enough. Magner tells Casson he is right, but it's not the answer he likes to hear, and he asks Larson if he also knew about the Guardians. Larson, Of course, because he shouldn't be injured on this excursion, because it would hurt the dignity of the Chades, but give the maidens an opportunity. Ivelia asks about it, and she says it would be an insult to the maidens, and how would him being in danger be an opportunity for them? He tells her it's because he's not her, and that he isn't important in the family, and just recently, he was living trash, and if someone like that were to get injured, it would benefit the maidens, since he's weak. And that the maidens could use the incident to threaten the Chades. Ivelia wonders if this is how a child should think of his family, and he tells her not to misunderstand, and he's just speaking from a logical standpoint. She hugs him, and tells him he is still a maiden, and it's hurting her to hear him say such words, and she hopes the name doesn't weigh down on him too much. Larson thanks her, but notices Casson is shaking his fist. Casson yells out, saying he will be Larson's family, and that he can be much warmer to him. Larson is confused, and Ludia jumps onto him and tells him she's hungry. And now the exam is over, they can eat, right? He tells her yes, and it cuts to a few days later. We see Larson telling Magner he wants to go to the Tehran mountain range, because he's heard the views are amazing. And he wants to visit the real place, and not the one they saw in the subspace the other day. Magner asks if he wants to go on vacation, and Larson says no, and he found something in Ivelia's space, and it was something she created for him. Obviously, this is a lie. Magner asks why, and Larson tells him he could feel a strange mana in it, and it was her way of telling him she arranged something there. He asks how he didn't know about this, and Larson says maidens have their own ways of communicating. Magner buddy, this is not what it was. He asks if it's okay for him to know something so important, and Larson says he's his teacher. And that there are two reasons she communicated this way. One is to keep it a secret from Casson. And the other is to see if he would discover the message, so she killed two birds with one stone. Magner asks what's waiting for Larson, and he replies he'll know when he sees it, but he knows the approximate location. Larson actually knows where it is, and that it's an item originally meant for Casson, and is a chest plate, plus having Magner go would benefit him. Larson tells him where it is, and Magner is shocked. Larson asks what's wrong, and he tells him it's nothing. He just has a good memory of that place. It shows them exiting a portal, and Larson asks if they can take a break. Magner says no, and says time is money, friend. Larson tells him he's aware of the 3 days to get there, and Magner says it's only 1 day. Larson says it's only possible for him. Magner replies by saying he'll leave him behind if he doesn't keep up, and he should be able to keep up with the geezer. It cuts to Larson gasping, thinking that Magner is insane, because he'll die at this rate before even reaching the area. Larson falls to his knees, and begins to vomit. Magner asks why he's so weak, but says he got further than he thought he would. And that Rosalind wouldn't have made it this far. He asks Larson how he expects to be his student when he's this weak, and Larson asks if he's gonna take back what he said in front of the Chades. Magner is surprised because Larson's breathing is back to normal, and imagines how it would be if Larson had his fighting spirit unlocked. They continue walking, and we see Larson watching Magner wondering how he's moving so quickly as if he is the wind, and he has an epiphany and realizes he's been focusing on sending mana throughout his body, but could use it to take in the wind. He tries it, and is surprised that it's possible, and he unlocks a new skill that utilizes attributes, and while he can't be a proper elemental mage like Ludia, he can still use it because of transcendent mana. Magner watches and smirks. It then cuts to Larson panting on the ground, and he tells Magner anymore is impossible, and passes out. Magner is impressed by his accomplishment, and he reminisces about when he was 10, and says this would have been impossible for him at that age, and the same for his brother, the patriarch. But he says that Larson's body will get lighter the more he exerts himself, and then he is woken up due to being dragged by Magner. Magner tells him he took him to Mount Dragon's Head while he was asleep. Larson decides to pretend to look around while he finds a well, and comments on how the town is abandoned. Magner says it was probably a farm town, and Larson asks about the memory he mentioned before. Larson tells him since nobody is here, he'll look around for a bit. Heavenly Eye activates, and we learn that it was a bandit village Magner subjugated. And that he killed more than 10 bandits, and this isn't public knowledge. This is also where he met Mai, a young woman the bandits kidnapped, and he fell in love with her, and killed the bandits to save her. But she was poisoned and ended up dying before he took her out of the mountains. Larson wonders if this is why Magner never married, because he couldn't forget his first love. Larson asks if there's anything special here, and says he'll look around for more clues. Magner walks up to the well, and says nobody would pay attention to it, and it's where he threw the bandits' bodies, and he decides to take a look inside. He's shocked to find nothing in the well, and he wonders if someone took them away. But he puts his hand up and collides with a barrier. He realizes the body must be gone too, and wonders if it's to seal in the souls. He decides to break it, but is interrupted by Larson. Larson is glad that he finally found the well. Larson is confused because the well isn't meant to have a barrier. He asks Magner if he knows about barriers. Magner asks why, and Larson says he surely knows about the barrier already. Magner asks how a martial artist would know about barriers, and Larson says it's strange someone would put one up on a random well. And that employing a barrier takes a lot of time and money, and this one is more than 10 years old. Magner asks what he's trying to say. Larson says he thinks it was made naturally. Magner thinks that's crazy, but recalls what happened at the well with the bandits and Mai, and realizes she was able to freely walk around it. Larson says the only condition an object needs to set up a barrier is a special setting. Magner asks if that's what mages call it, and Larson says yes, and there's a secret he can only tell him. And then he tells him that his eyes can read supernatural settings. And because of that, he can sense the name Mai from the well. Magner is shocked, and Larson tells him this well is what his sister wants him to see, and it's called the Bloodied Well. Magner realizes that Larson's eyes are really special, and Larson says it's weird he doesn't sense any blood. Magner asks how much he knows, and Larson says that's all he can see, and then a cloud of purple smoke erupts from the well. A figure begins to form from the smoke, and we see the figure is Mai. She tells him it's been a long time. Larson realizes she isn't human, and that she's a yokai, and the smoke is a pheromone to seduce people. She asks if Magner came to find her because he couldn't forget about her. She asks how it is to meet his first love again, and while he's old, she's still beautiful. He tells her he's glad, and that he was thinking about how burdened he was when she died, but now he can let that burden go. She tells him it's been a while, so why don't they have a passionate moment together? While he was a kid back then, now he's more like a real man. So now she's more tempted to seduce him. Magner calls out to Larson, and we see him grab her by the throat, telling him to watch closely, and that this is the first lesson he has for him. He tells her that she's a yokai, and there are two ways to hunt them. First is to kill it physically, and the second is to use some type of energy to kill it. And what he will be showing him now is a basic technique in the Grandels, and it's one of their 4 basic volitions, called breakage. We see him emit a large amount of fighting spirit, and then punches a hole through Mai. She asks what he's done, and Larson realizes he didn't just hit her, but broke the space she was standing in. Mai asks if Magner is really trying to kill her, asking him how he could do this to her. Magner tells Larson to watch closely, as this is the first method. Larson tells him he understands and dashes toward her with his fist imbued with energy. He hits her, and she asks how he could do such a thing to someone so beautiful. Larson comments on how doing that made his chest tight due to mana, but once should be fine. Mai says it must be a competition, since only one of them can have her. And begins laughing while she slowly disappears. Larson stomps on her as she's leaving and asks Magner why he didn't kill her instantly. And Magner asks what he means, and Larson says he bet he didn't do it because he loves her. He bonks Larson, and Magner thinks that he's sharp, and comments on how the technique he used to defeat Mai was something a mage wouldn't be able to do, because they would lose their arm from all of the concentrated mana, and he doesn't know how his body withstood it. He tells Magner he'll teach him something else. Next, Larson asks if he can guess what it is, and Magner says yes. Larson asks if it's about hiding his eyes. Magner asks why, and Larson says that his siblings will be envious. Magner wonders why Larson trusts him so much, and how such a unique person came from the Maiden family. Before going into the well, we learn that it is an artificial dungeon, and Larson tells Magner he thinks it's a naturally forming one, and then jumps into the hole. Magner stares for a second, then quickly jumps in after him. Magner is surprised by how deep it is, and realizes that the bandit thing was a manipulated memory, and wonders how such a powerful yokai wasn't discovered, because Ivelia wouldn't have left it alone. Larson sees a window about the character settings destroyer, doubting the probability. He realizes it's Magner, and another message says the probability is being degraded. This shocks Larson, and he receives the creator's privilege again, and the blank he needs to fill in this time is why nobody found the well after 30 years. And now Larson needs to write something that isn't too far from how Casson originally discovered it, and he writes that only those with the heavenly eye can sense the well. Now the probability has been filled in, he waits for the second line, but nothing appears, and he wonders if it wasn't a perfect answer, and if this happens multiple times, the world may break. They land at the bottom of the well, and we learn it is the nest of a 1,000-year dragon. Magner asks Larson why he doesn't use magic, something like explore or investigate. Larson tells him he's only a second circle, and you need to be a third for it. Magner wonders how he's alive with a third circle's mana. Magner asks if they should check for other threats, and Larson says she wouldn't have tested him beyond his capabilities. Magner asks for him to make light with magic, and Larson nervously tells him unnecessary mana isn't good. They continue walking down the cave, and Larson realizes it's humid, so it must be near, and he finds a pond, and they hear a voice saying to go back. Magner asks why she put this here, and Larson says it's just a toy she picked up, and it's called a bronze giant. Magner jokes about it being small for a giant, and Larson tells him it's about average. The giant tells them to go back again. Magner tells Larson he will lose if he were to fight it. Larson tells him, of course, but he cannot give up here. Larson realizes if he makes one mistake, it's over for him, and that in the novel, the giant's fire strike severely damaged Casson, and we see Larson dodge the attack. He is saying he won't be hit by it. He gets into the water and says he will bring down the giant in a single strike. Magner watches and thinks something fun is about to happen, and we see the giant imbues his sword with fire, and swings at Larson. He dodges most of it, but is burnt on his back. And he says it's nothing compared to what Casson dealt with in the novel. The giant rushes in, and he says this is his opportunity, and while Casson charged it directly, he can't do that. Larson activates his self-defense skill, and jumps onto the sword. He says he can tolerate the heat for a few seconds, and says he just needs to get to the joint. The sword hits a wall, and we see Larson use the chance to get on top of the giant's head, and how Casson used the joints to defeat it too. He decides to try the skill Magner taught him, but an arrow covered in poison grazes his back. And he realizes he focused too much on the giant. He is slammed into the wall and falls to the floor, but we learn his attack actually took one of the giant's arms off. As he was dodging the giant, he concentrated his mana on his fist, and deflected the sword, which is what sent him flying. He asks Magner for help, saying he's used all of his mana, and Magner says fine since he gave him a good show, and that he will give him one too. The giant swings at Magner, but Magner tells the giant to fall apart, and we see a giant explosion. Larson says this must be what the world setting mentions. Supreme Being's words are laced with authority, and he wonders if he can truly survive here. It cuts to outside and we see Hera and Hampton running through a forest, and he asks her if they can rest. She barks at him for being weak, and he tells her she's just strong. She tells Hampton to wait, and we see her in front of the well. She has a flashback to Larson telling her where they will be, and that the well will be the entrance to the dungeon, and to find him. It goes back to Larson and he's telling Magner he should have helped him earlier, and he tells Magner if there's a guardian there must be a treasure. He tells Magner he'll lead the way, but asks if he also noticed the giant was covered in a weird oil. Magner is glad he noticed, and we learn the oil is to prevent degradation, and Larson says it's strange that it was rusted even after being coated in the oil. Magner reminisces of a flashback of him and Ivelia when she was a kid and he's reminding him of her. Larson says the path must also be filled with poison since Letten is weak to it, and the giant was rusted. Magner tells him he's right, and he warns Larson if he consumes the poison he won't be able to move his arms or legs anymore, and he can't do anything since he isn't a mage. Larson tells him he's prepared something just in case, and it cuts back to Hampton above the well looking in, and here a Spartan kicks him into it. That kick was definitely personal, and Larson tells Magner if there is poison there is an antidote. Hampton and Hera land at the bottom of the well, and he cries while asking if she's trying to kill him, and she threatens him to get up already before he really dies. She leads him to Larson, and they greet Magner. Larson tells him that Decatra put them under his care because he is lacking so much, and Magner comments on how a normal person has an aura to show they are weak or strong, but someone without an aura is scary. He compliments Hera saying she is the best assassin he's seen, and she says if he's seen the others then they are dead, so she is the best. Magner asks if Hampton has poison on him, and he says yes. Hampton catches some strays from Magner, and Magner asks when Hampton is going to get rid of the poison, and Hampton says he cannot get rid of it, but he can make an antidote. Larson pats his head and thanks him. And Hampton says of course while smiling. Hampton tells Larson if he holds the antidote in his mouth he'll be able to resist most of the poison, but not to swallow it. Magner and Larson head into the poison, and we see they've arrived at where the chest plate is located. Larson spots it on a pedestal, and we learn the armor is like an extra life. And he sees a message appear saying only the successor can read this, and since Magner isn't saying anything, only he can see it. He realizes that because of this there are things in the world he doesn't know about despite being the author, and he puts the dragon chest plate on, and we see it change into a form of mana. It cuts to Grail in a cozy blanket saying it feels nice. Larson thanks Magner, and Magner says if he wants to thank him then pay him. It cuts to Larson and Casson in a bath and Larson is telling him about his new armor. Casson is excited about it, and Larson tells him to punch him, and Casson says it would be better to test with a sword. We can hear them talking, and we see Smooth Brain outside wearing a floaty tube wanting to play too. We learn the durability of the chest plate can be recovered using mana, and Larson asks Casson to stand guard while he does some breathing techniques. Casson is happy about stabbing his friend, and thinks this is what a hero's friendship is like, and we see Larson using mana to repair the chest plate, and he thanks Casson for guarding him. And Casson says no problem, and he will see him tomorrow. Larson calls out for Hera, and asks if she wants to try stabbing him for real, and she tells him if she does it for real he will die. And he tells her never mind. She tells him that he must become strong, and he tells her he will. Then we skip an entire year ahead. We see the mountains behind the Sade house, and Magner is saying that now the basic stamina training is over, and they are talking about training. Larson is surprised and calls out to his sister, and Magner says he won't be deceived this time, and Larson tells him he isn't lying this time, and Ivelia greets them. Larson tells her he missed her. We learn he wrote her a letter, and she tells him she wishes it wasn't respect, but affection, and love would have been nice. She laughs and asks if he wants to leave Ludia with her, and he tells her yes. And we see that Ludia has been fighting with monkeys over bananas. She asks if he's asking for her to raise someone who isn't a maiden, and he tells her that she's tied to him by a special contract, and she has to obey him, and he also has to obey Ivelia. She asks if he's saying he'll work under her, and he says yes, if she will let him. She asks him what he's been doing for the last year, and while he hasn't grown as a mage, he tells her he focused on making himself a better vessel for purer mana, because his techniques pressure his body greatly. And he has been creating a vessel that could withstand that pressure. She yells out to him, asking who he thinks she is, and he tells her that she's the best candidate for Patriarch, and she says that she isn't asking about his mana, but what he's done over the last year. He realizes he misjudged her, and asks if she wants to have dinner with him as a family, and she likes to hear that. And he tells her he will get her flowers too. It shows Larson in bed recalling what Ivelia said, and he asks Hera what he thinks she is planning for him, and he's excited to see what she has planned. It cuts to morning, and we see Larson asking Ivelia if she slept well. She says he seems to be in a good mood, and asks if he understands what he needs to do. He says yes, and that he needs to prove he's become stronger despite his mana not increasing, and the only test they can logically do is to hunt poison goblins in the mountains. She says he's correct, and asks if he's ready to go. He takes her hand, and asks if he can bring Hampton along too. We see them go through a portal, and we learn they are at the Byron Stone Mountains. And it is a place that he wrote about in a lot of detail, and it's one of the most dangerous places in the world. Larson asks Ivelia if she's just going to watch, and she says yes. They see a signpost that warns them of poison goblins, and do not approach, but now they know which way to go. Hampton, clearly tired, asks how long they have left, and Larson tells him they are almost there. They arrive nearby, and he tells Hampton to spread about what he's prepared. Ivelia watches as Hampton spreads stuff around, and she was just expecting to kill the rest of the goblins after Larson killed one, since he won't be able to kill a whole pack, but it seems he's prepared something more interesting than she thought. After a bit Larson tells Hampton it's enough, and asks if he can climb trees? And he says maybe. Larson says never mind and carries him atop a tree. Ivelia watches and is surprised by how light his movements looked, and we see a bunch of goblins appear. She tells Larson that mages would never use a method like this, and he tells her he doesn't want to work for her as a mage, and he plans to be someone more special. We see Larson and Hampton are still watching the goblins, and Ivelia understands now that he set this plan up, knowing about the goblins living in packs. And Larson says yes, and since they live in packs, they will get envious of seeing another tribe with meat, and start a fight. We see the goblins fighting, and Larson just has to watch for now. The goblins continue their go-beside, and Ivelia just counts their numbers as they die. We see a single goblin left, and he begins to laugh. Larson looks down at him, and it notices his presence, but it is too late. Larson instantly closes the gap and uses the technique Magner taught him, and obliterates the goblin. We learn 24 goblins died, and Ivelia wonders what Father would have thought if he watched this, and she notices that Larson is wearing some heavy-ass armor. And he tells her that he knows she probably wanted to see magic, but on the way here, he marked goblin dens as they passed by, so he will show her his path of magic. We see them enter a cave, and Larson mentions if the leader were a warrior, it would have shown itself, but if it's a witch doctor, then it wouldn't have yet. They spot the witch doctor, and it is in fear due to Ivelia's presence. Larson approaches it, and imbues his fist with mana, and tells the leader farewell. It cuts to them out of the cave, and Ivelia asks Larson if he only approached the leader because she was there? And he says yes, and she says a weak mind is not a good thing, which surprises him. She happily tells him she doesn't mind that answer, and as they go to leave, she tells him since she tested him this time, she will bring him presents next time. Hampton asks Larson if they will need to walk back home, and he tells Hampton they will stay here for a few days. And he asks Hampton if he knows why they are staying, and he says no. Larson tells him it's because he left Ludia with Ivelia, and Hera will notice they are gone, so she'll come for them if they just wait. And since they removed most of the goblins, it should be safe for a while. Hampton asks if he came here to save the people living in this unprotected region. And Hampton looks sad while talking about how most humans live in regions like this, and his parents died in an area like this. And he cries while saying he's proud of Larson, and Larson goes along with it, but then wonders how his sister would feel after this, and then he has an epiphany that if it's the Ivelia he wrote about, then there must be another test remaining. He tells Hampton to run to the cave without looking up on the count of 3. Hampton the goober looks up to see a giant white tiger. The tiger lets out a roar, and Larson begins to count to 3. The tiger continues to roar, and we see Hampton begins to run toward it. But he notices Larson isn't following him, and he wonders if Larson is going to be bait, but continues doing as he was told. Larson talks to the tiger, and tells it to focus on him. The tiger leaps toward him, and he thinks about how Ivelia was probably disappointed that her test was cleared easily, and since she wants to see her limit, he'll go along with it. And how a year ago this wouldn't have been possible. He begins to use the wind attribute he learned while following Magner, and says he will pass this test easily. I'm calling Cap. He asks the tiger if it's confident in its speed, and tells it to try and keep up, and we see them dashing through the forest. The tiger bites at Larson, and bites down, but Larson evades to its side and says it's the end for it. Larson imbues his fist with energy, and hits the tiger directly, asks what it thinks of that. The tiger coughs up blood, then attacks at Larson, and he realizes he is going to be hit, so he puts his hands up to block it. He activates his self-defense skill, and gets absolutely bodied by the attack, slamming into the floor like a DBZ combo. His durability decreases on his chest plate, and we see he has broken his arm and a rib. And if it weren't for his chest plate, he would have died on the spot. He knows that he's faster than the tiger, and decides to run to the cave with Hampton inside it, and to come up with a plan. We see Hampton applying herbs to him while apologizing, and he tells him if he just used him as bait, he wouldn't have been hurt. Larson tells him he isn't wrong, and Hampton begins to say dying instead of him is his job, and Larson tells him to shut up. Larson asks him how he would live if his shadow died, and he would never let him die like that. Hampton respects Larson even more now, and we hear the tiger screeching, and then they realize it cannot enter the cave. Larson says he thought the cave was weird, and for a place where a large amount of goblins lived, there weren't many goblins outside, so the goblins were trapped in this cave. And this allows for the goblins' poison to pile up, and the white tiger couldn't approach because it is weak to poison. We learn that Ivelia is actually the one who trapped the goblins inside of this cave, and Hampton says she must have done it to make this place safe from the tiger, so now they just need to wait for Hera, right? Larson says no, even though it would be the safest route, they will kill the tiger before Hera arrives. And he asks Hampton to prepare some paralysis poison, and Hampton says he won't be able to make enough to paralyze it. Larson replies by saying they don't need to do that, just enough to make it uncomfortable. It cuts to the poison being finished, and Larson tells him to chop up a goblin and cover it with the poison. We see Larson throwing the body parts out of the cave, we hear the tiger roaring while Hampton rizzes it up. It shows them sitting down, and Larson is counting, And after 30 minutes, he stands up, and we see the giant tiger is exhausted. And Larson comments on how in this world it's impossible for an 11-year-old to hunt a white tiger in this world, and that's why Ivelia gave him this task. And this is why he has to show her all of the progress he made within this last year. He reminisces over the last 2 years since he's possessed the body, and he has 7 years left for his predetermined death. So he must change this world no matter what. To become stronger than Ivelia, stronger than Decatra, and of course, stronger than Cassin. The tiger roars at him, and Larson tells it that it's time for round 2. Due to his strong determination, Blitz tactic unlocks. Larson, confused, activates the ability, and we see his mana begins to form a blinding light. Hampton recognizes that now he has enough mana to be on par with a 4th circle, and we see Larson has gone Ultra Instinct. He can only maintain this form for 3 seconds, and that the skill uses up all of the mana in his body instantly, and he recalls the profound law behind fighting spirit that Magner taught him. Magner explains all of the different types, like strength is for the body and spirit, destruction is also body and spirit, and cutting off is for the creation of lines on a surface, and death is creating dots from the line. And that this is the profound law behind fighting spirit. If anyone understood this, you're low-key mega mind. We see Larson with a bucket of water on his head, and he tells him he has no idea what he means, and Magner says it's pretty much possessing a will, and that the laws will react to it. And asks if he wants a demonstration. Larson asks what he means, and Magner says if he punches the land, he can crack the continent they are standing on. Larson laughs, asking what kind of nonsense he is spewing, and we see Magner channel all of his fighting spirit, and Larson realizes he isn't joking and tells him to stop, but the bucket on his head spills. And Magner asks if he understands now. It goes back to the present, and we see Larson saying he has no time and he needs to imbue his will into his mana. And he tells the tiger he will kill it no matter what, and that he will become stronger. While powering up for a one-hit KO, Larson realizes that he only has 3 seconds left, so he dashes toward the tiger, but he loses his balance because of the increase in his physical abilities. Now he has 2 seconds left, so he uses his wind attribute to push himself forward. We see a trail of energy follow behind him, and with 1 second left, he tells himself to be willing to kill. And he resolves himself to kill the white tiger. His fist glows yellow, and we see an explosion occur. Hampton watches, unsure as to what happened, and we see Larson panting, and his abilities deactivate, and he thanks Ivelia for her reward. Hampton approaches him, and we see Grail is drained of energy. Larson is unable to move his body, or even reply to Hampton. They suddenly hear another white tiger growling at them, but Larson says it's as he thought, and we see Hera standing in front of them. She tells Larson he can rest now, and she chops the tiger into pieces. And while covered in blood, she tells Larson and Hampton she's glad they are okay. Larson's consciousness begins to fade, and he passes out. We learn he slept for 4 days, and during that time, he dreamed of himself as Cha Sungmin again, and his ordinary days as an employee during the day, and author at night. And during this dream, he completely forgot that he possessed Larson's body. He wakes up panting. Hera greets him, and he asks how long he was out for, and she tells him 3 days. He sees a jar and gets shocked about it, and Hera tells him it's the heart of the tiger she killed, because he blew up the one he killed. He asks why it's here, and she says it's because it's suitable for mana recovery. He thanks her, and says it seems as if Ivelia knew she would be coming. Which is why she prepared 2 white tigers, but something is bothering him. And he tells her that with her skills, she should have known about the 2 tigers as soon as she entered the mountain, and despite that, she walked slowly with a tiger on her back. She tells him that a tiger won't affect her speed, and he doesn't doubt it because she is the goat. He says that there must be something Ivelia asked her to do, but knowing Hera's personality, she probably turned it down. And due to this, Ivelia probably cast restriction magic on her. Hera tells him he is correct, and realizes that Larson isn't talking to her directly, and that Ivelia is listening. He tells her since he's done with the homework, he should get back to training. We see Ivelia floating outside, and she disappears into her magic circle. And we see her talking to Decatra, and he's asking if Larson is okay. And she tells him, yes, he's maintaining his second circle. He tells her since he's done with the homework, he should get back to training. Ivelia tells him she plans on making Larson one of her own. He replies by saying that the war is theirs to deal with, but he has something he would like to ask her. And he asks what Larson has done to make her so emotional. She tells him she likes him a lot, even if he's lacking as a mage. He is the most clever child she has seen, and even the right amount of selfishness, and if he permitted it, she would like his permission to make Larson one of hers. He tells her that's something for her to decide, and she thanks him. After that day, many days pass by, and we are at another time skip, this time of 3 years. And now he is 14. We see Hira call out to Larson, and she tells him that a letter from Decatra has arrived. And Larson asks Hira to cut his hair, and she asks if he has read the letter yet. He tells her yes, and he needs to go back to the main residence, because when a maiden is 14, they need to participate in a pilgrimage. And he plans to explore the world, collect artifacts, and hire people out of the family. She asks if he means his own people, and he tells her yes. He asks what she will do first at the residence, and she tells him she plans to clean and unpack her room. He tells her to get a servant to do that, because she isn't one anymore. She asks what he thinks of his haircut, and he tells her he likes it, and thanks her. She says it's nothing, then asks what he plans to do first. And he tells her he's thought about it for a while, and he's decided to, and that is the end of season 1. Subscribe for more videos like this, leave a like or a comment to help the channel out. Thanks for watching.